save everything. I'm sure you guys have seen that little notification. Um, I know double audio, so let me make sure I don't have that going on, and then I'll
Save
clip it.
everything. I'm sure you
There we
get
go.
email notification.
All right, there we go. All right, I think I close this, and I think it's okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you for sitting through all of that. Um, and I don't think I need any of these things. There we go. Well, welcome, guys. Let me do the thing that Jeff always does. I think he does it before you guys log in, which is today's February 14th, Valentine's Day. It's week 2 of the February Basic Training Group. Um, and we have an amazing crowd here. Let me get my second screen going as well. I like to personally start out just kind of getting like a little bit of a vibe check from all of you guys. You've now put in somewhere between 10 and 20 hours of work so far, but I like to just kind of check in and see where everyone's at in the process. Kind of any like preliminary questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to make sure that Bobby's able to connect. He seems to be having a little bit of trouble, but I'm just going to go around my Brady Bunch screen here and just kind of, why don't you guys give me like a 2 sentence, how your week's been, if there's any questions that are on your mind that you want to go over today, or even if there's just stuff for us to kind of review kind of separately in terms of if you're having trouble getting hours in. We can kind of go through some planning stuff, even in office hours. But yeah, Brian, why don't you open us up with how your week's been, what you're up, like kind of like any big questions or anything like that, just how your progress is coming along.
Thanks. It's great to see everybody. Great to be here. This week's been it's been pretty crazy. My day-to-day job had like a huge tranche of work, so it definitely compressed the hours I was able to put in this week. Um, and then as far as the writing, just putting heavy hours in where I can. It's not been as broken up as kind of was suggested in the PDF that was sent, the
Hmm.
workbook. So rather than like working 1 hour, I would be working like 3 hours.
Okay.
And the part that I tried to work on was instead of trying to go at a very overly focused pace where it becomes
Yeah.
work, I tried to like turn the pace down so that
Okay.
it was fun and like it felt open. And rather than just being kind of like kind of overly focused by the end of it. So I was trying to remember it's like writing is fun. So you want the
Yeah.
pace to kind of be reflective of that. So I get used to working in that pace as the classes go on. So that's what I tried to focus on. Characters kind of started to come,
Great.
and the premise line took a little longer than I thought, but it was fun to kind of put more work into it and then kind of work it, especially working with the main character and dynamic characters interaction. As
Yes.
Jeff had said that was pivotal um, in the success of the premise line. But yeah,
Yeah.
so that's
Absolutely. I think that's great. And I mean, just kind of stemming off of that, the thing on yes ending for everyone who's done improving is I think it is meant to be fun. I mean, I have this conversation all the time in terms of like, people kind of ask like what project should I work on? And especially if you're between two projects and you don't really know the best thing to work on, I think that people tend to knee jerk to like, I'm gonna work on the thing I think I can sell. And, realistically, if you're personally not as excited about a project, the odds of you actually selling it are slim to none because what are the odds you're going to finish it and it's really going to be a fantastic project that's like ready to go and be sold, right? So the thing that makes you the most excited is always the thing to really work on and it keeps your hours kind of chugging along and um just it just makes you most excited. I think I had this conversation with Martha during office hours this week, maybe with someone else, and I'm forgetting. I think there's so much mileage in terms of um, sorry, I had an email that just kind of blew my train of thought there. What was I gonna say? Well, I blanked. Sorry, I had a good conversation with Martha during office hours, and if it comes back around to me, I will identify what it what it was. But anyway, yeah. Let me move on. I'll come back around if I get to it. Aman, how's your week going? First off, I feel like I had that coffee mug when I was like a little kid. Can we get like a show off of the coffee mug? Because that feels so like familiar. Yeah, it's a Garfield one, right? I swear. I had those when I was a kid. I literally forgot all about that mug and I saw you holding it. I was like, wait, why am I like nostalgia-ing to like when I was like 5 years old drinking hot cocoa and
Yeah, when I
you
saw him, I made sure to get like 5 or 6 of them because I was like, how nostalgic is this mug?
know,
Um,
love it, love it. How's
so
your weekend
uh
besides drinking an awesome mug?
thank you. For me, this had to be like the busiest week ever. Of course, it's like the first week work. I'm like, everybody wants to take vacation, so I'm working for everybody, and my job is very physically taxing. So by the time I finish working, I'm like exhausted. And so I really like one thing about my beauty sleep. I'm like nothing is gonna get in the way of my beauty rest.
I hear that.
So it was quite difficult to manage everything, considering like within the first week I was like, what did I get myself into? I was like, but I can't be the person that like fails and like drops off because I had an idea and then I was like, what? Like this sounds crazy, you know what I mean? And how do I even
Yeah.
start? And it just became a lot until like I just kind of waited into my day off to really set the intention on
Yeah.
focus. And because I'm the type of student where I have to have all of the details and all the information to truly know what I'm doing. Like I'm very studious in that way of like read the instructions, understand what everything is, and then I can apply what comes to mind. So
Okay.
it wasn't this week wasn't for me like just like a free thought process of like just jotting ideas and blah blah blah. It was mainly like I have to set a real intention um to what I'm doing. You know what I mean? So that I can know what my focus like where my focus is going to be. And
Totally.
so I had two stories initially that I wanted to choose from. I ended up picking one and like Brian said, I kind of like smashed all the hours in one day. Like it
Sure.
wasn't spread out at all. Like maybe a few hours were spread out, like because I only had 2 days off this week. So on those 2 days off, it was like maybe like 3 hours here and then 6 hours like
Yeah.
all of yesterday, which is fine because that kind of works for me because I'm kind of still in the university kind of mindset. Like I'm still approaching this as if I'm like a student in university. So yeah, I'm just trying to figure out like what works for me, where I can, you know what I mean, what my schedule can do. And yeah,
I
my
honestly, I
premise
think
line,
that
I followed all the instructions, I got all the steps, and here I am.
I think that's honestly great. And look, I think that we lay it out two things. One, we lay out the hours that are there so that people don't kind of get stuck on a single exercise,
Hmm.
largely because, oh, hey there.
Well,
Uh,
say hi to class.
what a cutie. Welcome to the class. I'll send you your enlistment agreement and you'll just charge the same credit card. No, I think it's one of those things where we want to kind of keep you guys honest in terms of no one in here at least has admitted to doing this, whether they do it or not, I don't know of it yet. Um, People will be like, "Oh, I've been like brainstorming the 50/50s while I like walk along the beach for 3 hours." And you're kind of like, "Okay, what are the odds that you're really being productive as compared to like enjoying the beach, running into people you know and having a conversation?" So it is a way of kind of making sure that you're honoring the exercises, but also moving forward and not allowing yourself, even not in that extreme case of kind of wandering mind, not getting stuck on trying to perfect any one thing. Um, that being said, I think also given the fact that you're a parent, and just, life, work, all that other stuff, even if you're not a parent, right? It's great when you're able to start to figure out where your hours are going to come from in your week as a writer. I think as you get to be more and more proficient as a writer, it becomes a little bit easier because you get into your personal habits. You're able to kind of jump in and actually start doing exercises or doing writing pages, whatever it may be. Whereas typically when writers are newer, they kind of need that like ramp up period of a half hour and then kind of the wind down period where you're not as productive for your last half hour. And realistically, if you're only allotting yourself an hour, by the time you've gotten through a half hour ramp up and a half hour cool down, you've done no actual work in that entire hour. That's why we often kind of, encourage people to give themselves like 2 hours, but like just, like I went to grad school for writing and we were working on multiple, which was chaotic in and of itself. But like, I mean, there were times where I would just have like a 15-minute window, and you do get to a place where you're like, all right, I need to write that scene because it's due tomorrow as part of my pages or whatever. Let me just bang this out in 15 minutes, and you don't really give yourself that ramp up, cool down, that kind of stuff. So as you get to be more proficient at this, yeah, you can kind of figure out what your hours look like. And yeah, sometimes it is just I have Sundays to myself, and I'm going to use that and commit 6 hours straight, and I could be productive for 6 hours straight. We had Matt Nix, who's an alumni, come talk to our writers last summer. Maybe that was the summer before at this point. But he kind of talked about that a lot, where he like he wakes up in the morning and like works out for an hour and then I guess showers, hopefully, and then immediately starts writing for 5 straight hours. And then he's like done with his day of writing by 11 a.m. because he gets up at like 5 a.m. Like that kind of thing. And so, we've had some people who do that. And frankly, if you're able to get 5 hours in every morning, before 11 a.m. and you start work at say noon, or you're a waiter or whatever, you're on the other side of times, you might have an incredibly productive day. So, I think that's all good stuff to start to work through. I did remember what I was going to say about that. I talked to, I think it was Martha and Bo, if I remember correctly, uh, that right now you're in like the hardest times of your like creative choices that we're putting you through. I think a lot of times writers feel like, well, the writing of the pages is the biggest commitment, but realistically, if you put in your hours now and you are productive and making really difficult decisions now, the writing of the pages essentially becomes like the easiest part of this program. So, yeah, it should feel really difficult right now, and you should be kind of, to Brian's point, sometimes overanalyzing and putting too much time into any one exercise a little bit, and a little bit of permission. We do kind of factor in some of those hours for people early on. And then Aman, I just wanted to kind of quickly speak to something to be hopefully helpful, but not necessarily undermine the way you learn. And again, I think Bo, I think we had this conversation also. Uh, I think something that's really important as you're going through this process is, yes, you're learning along the way and you're putting all of these exercises into this script. But one of the biggest takeaways that I would say for all of you is as you work through this process, be okay with making mistakes along the way and learning from those mistakes. And then thinking about, not too, don't spend too much time on this, but thinking about a little bit of like what caused those mistakes or what weren't you thinking about along the process that when you go to use these exercises the next time, you're asking yourself better questions so you get more out of the exercises. And I think that's a lot of not only what you should be trying to get out of all of this, but also, what I can help provide during office hours. I think I try to be as nice as possible, but I feel like I'm often like the jerk in all of your guys' lives that are like, but have you thought about this thing? And it's not my dad always says, it's not that I'm smarter than you are, it's that I've done this, I've been doing this for longer. I have that wisdom. And so, I've worked with a lot of writers, we worked with a lot of writers, and we've worked through this process and we see what leads to success and what leads to struggles. And we want to get you thinking about the right things as well. So give yourself some permission to, fail along the way and learn from that process as much as you can. I think I was very much the same way in school where I was like, I need to know everything and then I could go do a thing before I have to. So I totally understand where you're coming from, but I'm trying to give some permissions here. Bo, why don't you jump in, tell us how your week's been and what's been going on?
Yeah, I think you summed up our conversation well. It does feel like this part is the most difficult part. I have a premise line, and I'm not convinced it's the one I'm going to continue with, and not in like a keep revising it sort of way, more in a I was trying to do other exercises once I had that initial premise line, like coming up with scenes. And I
Yeah,
found I was struggling to come up with scenes, or I wasn't really like feeling passionate about what scenes
yeah,
could be in it, which I think might be an indicator.
totally.
But one question I did have
Yeah.
was in the book, in the, what is this? In the workbook, there's a section that says the second act is like the opposite of the misbehavior.
Yeah.
Um, and the way I'm understanding that is that that's basically where the character is like learning his lesson. So let's say his misbehavior is like being stuck in the past, not
Sure.
wanting to move forward. So that second act is when he's learning to not be stuck in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wrote it down and let's spend some time on that because we're going to be going over today. We're going to start to touch on the 363, which is where that focus will be.
Okay.
So we'll let that breathe, and then if you have more questions after I kind of give a little bit of an explainer,
Yep.
uh, ask away. So just
Okay.
keep that write down all your questions. If I don't get to them, we'll make sure to get to them.
Great.
Uh,
Okay. Because that was a sticking point. So
yeah,
yeah, we'll
it's
we'll um we'll go over that when it's
we'll go over
appropriate.
that, and I think I have like an analogy that I don't think Jeff uses it, but I absolutely fucking love this analogy. So I'm gonna write it down so I don't forget to. I don't think I would because I think I say it inevitably. I'll say it today, and then you guys will call with your 363s in the next 2 weeks, and I'll say it to all of you guys again, and I'll find out if you're the kind of people who politely like pretend like you haven't heard me say something and just listen to a whole analogy for a second time, or if you're the kind of person who's like, Brad, you said this during week 2. We could like move past this analogy. It's okay. Um, Either one's fine. But yeah, let's definitely spend some time on that. It'll also be helpful because we're going to talk a little bit about misbehavior too as we go over the checklist for premise line. So I think we're going to do a lot of work in the next like hour or so that'll hopefully answer a lot of those questions.
Cool. Thank you.
I did have a funny, just as an anecdotal thing. I don't have an anecdotal thing for everyone, just back to back Iman and Bo. I'm a big like minute cryptic person. I don't know if anyone else does this, but your name was like, so it's kind of like a weird crossword thing. But today's minute cryptic, I'm not going to say too much. It doesn't seem like anyone does this besides me, but my girlfriend's downstairs and she also does it, and I solved it without her. But your name was like the first word of the clue. And I'm so glad that I like solved this fucking clue because I was like, man, if he's just sitting here the whole time, I'm just be thinking about that cryptic crossword and trying to figure out what it is. But I got it, so we're all good. I won't spoil it. But check it out. High recommend if anyone's into like any type of word games, Minute Cryptic. Worth some time. Candace, what's going on? I don't have a good story yet. Maybe if you pick something up, I'll be like, oh yeah. But like what's going on? How's your week been?
Hi. I would describe my writing week as a failure. I think I
Okay.
completely underestimated the um the time. Like I think I looked at it and I was like, oh, just 30 minutes this day, just an hour this day, and I would never put that hour in. I would never get around to that 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Um, and so that won't happen again.
Right.
But yeah, the premise line, the notes that Jeff sent me back definitely helped.
Yeah.
And it actually helped me think about even where the story is going to go.
Yeah.
Um, and at first I didn't really understand the difference between a premise line and a log line, but
Sure.
after working through it and rewriting it, I definitely get that. Um, but but yeah, that's
That's
pretty
great.
much.
One, appreciate the honesty. Two, I think that's okay. We built in a few extra free hours in the beginning of this for people to learn from their mistakes, and it seems like you're learning from it, so that's great. And three, I think realistically, like, we're gonna go over some premise lines today. Appreciate everyone who sent it in. I'll try not to be overly harsh. I feel like receiving notes is always like a I think that oftentimes people would rather be like hit with a baseball bat than like get notes in public, but I'll try not to be too awful to anybody. But honestly, I think as you kind of move down the track of this project, you guys will inevitably see more of the limitations of your premise lines through that process. And this is kind of what I was saying to Aman earlier. kind of as you move forward, you'll be like, oh, I didn't think about that thing. And it'll kind of spark that connection of like, well, I should have been spending more time on what my second act adventure is and how that actually directly connects to what my character's going through. And even kind of what Bo was saying earlier of like, how is the second act like the opposite of a misbehavior? Well, a lot of the times, you're sometimes sitting there going, uh, I'm writing so much plot stuff in my second act as I'm writing out this sentence. How could I possibly describe character growth? And that's something I get a lot. I don't think I got this from anyone in this group over the week one office hours, but it's like, oh, I'm just not phrasing it correctly. And it's a very interesting dynamic as though like it's not a limitation of I haven't figured out the connection yet. It's that the words I'm picking are not the correct words. And I think that that's such an interesting dynamic of like if you really spend time and do it for a movie that you love, you probably wouldn't have that trouble. Now, that movie has been made. The writer has gone through many revisions, right? Like there's a lot of work that went into making sure that you could not miss the story that is meant to be told. And you guys are on the opposite end of that spectrum. You're starting this project, you're new to your ideas in some way. So it's okay that you are limited in a way that a movie is not. But I always want to give permission of like, be okay with being limited now, but also learn from that limitation as you move forward and then reflect back a little bit. I'll just double down on that note as you kind of spend your next few hours. Glenn, how's the week been?
It was good. It was a kind of a weird week for me because I was in Vegas at a trade show all week, so I was trying to fit in my hours, like 10 minutes between meetings, running back to the hotel room, get an hour in there, or like riding on the plane, that kind of stuff. So I don't. I fortunately I'm back home now, so I can be on a little bit more of a regular schedule going forward. But I think I got quite a bit of work done with it. The premise line feedback that you and Jeff provided was great. It was very challenging, I would say, to try and address the feedback. I literally in
Yeah.
my notes here, I think I have, I don't know, 25 takes on the premise line.
Yeah.
Just different little wordings. Like I noticed that you both, Jeff, said the word struggles doesn't mean anything, and I'm like, how do I convey what I'm trying to convey with that word and use it in a different way that's much more literal or much more like visual. So that going through that kind of exercise I think was good. And then I also did the premise checklist. That was actually, I think, a really useful but very also very challenging exercise, because when I was getting into this stuff like the dynamic progression and the second act complication and the third party opponent motive, that kind of stuff. When I was getting into trying to specifically answer those questions, it kind of forced me to really think about some very specific aspects of the second half of the second act, and then the third act that I hadn't really gotten, my brain hadn't started to process those. So I think it kind of helped me also with the premise line, but then also with the 50/50s, because I started, sort of brainstorming scenes and ideas that might help flesh that out. So anyway, I don't think I didn't get all 50 and 50 and all, what was it, 20 and 20, and I think I'm like
Yeah.
at,
That's
28,
okay.
34, something like that.
Listen, it's a start to an exercise and it's meant to get you moving in a direction. And so yeah, you'll spend a little bit more time on it. Don't kill yourself over any one exercise is the biggest takeaway. This is all meant to be worked on as one bigger view of a single project, right? So it's okay if you're not nailing everything. And frankly, some movies, especially as you get into the 2020s for the dynamic and the opponent, like one movie I often pick on because people will often ask, like, how much does the opponent need to be in a project? I don't know if any of you guys saw, I'm sure at least at some point you saw it, although it's an older movie, The Fifth Element, that Bruce Willis movie, right? And Gary Oldman is the opponent in that movie. And I mean, I think he literally has like 5 scenes, only one of which actually overlaps with Bruce Willis. Now I bring that movie up as an extreme example. I'm not saying, hey, your goal should be to have the opponent in as little as possible, even though that movie was successful. And I thought it was a well done, good movie. thematically it was interesting, plot wise it was interesting. It had a budget that I think would be hard to maybe get all the time these days unless you're getting Bruce Willis on board, or the next Bruce Willis on board. But I think that it's still one of those things where it showcases that there are not a set of rules to a movie, as compared to, like I often bring up Lady Bird as an example of like a movie where Marion, the mother, is both the dynamic character and the opponent, and at the same time, because she can't be dating her own daughter or be high school best friends with her, we have proxy opponents and proxy dynamics. And similarly, we have movies where, it is really just a one-on-one story, and the main character is, locked away in a room with the opponent who's also the dynamic character, and they spend every single scene together. It's most of like Duplass written and directed type of movies because they limit it to a couple of locations and a couple of characters, right? So you really can run the gamut. So be okay with, maybe there's a limitation. If my movie is more like The Fifth Element, I'm probably not going to have 20 scenes with my opponent. Martha, knowing a little bit more about your project, that might be one of the harder exercises for you. It's like, it doesn't sound, and I'm limited in what I know of it, but I know a little bit. It sounds like maybe your opponent's not going to be the most active opponent character in the world, and therefore you might not have as many scenes. That's okay. So just some things to think about. Versus like Bo, I don't know if I know exactly what your project is at this moment, but like, having spoken to you about what you like to write, I would speculate that you're going to write a project where your opponent is probably going to be active in your story. So yeah, Bobby, I'm realizing you're like logged in twice, it seems. I don't know if that's like intentional or unintentional.
No, am I? Oh, I didn't
It's
know.
okay. I don't know. I don't know if there's anything I could do about it. I could
Well, I'm schizoid,
just
so
like,
no,
let
I'm
me see if
just
I could like remove you because this is like kind of annoying
I don't
me
see.
in a way. If I kick you off, just log back in.
Okay.
Once Bobby is, I'll be able to. Oh wait, I don't want to do that. See if I can just hide this. Yeah, that worked. Okay, you're fine. All
I
right.
tried
How's
to come in once and then it said put your code in. I was like, oh hell, what's my code? So I
Yeah,
then
think
went to
that's it.
another one.
You're totally okay. I hid you, so now you're good.
Okay.
Yeah, give us the breakdown of how your week's been.
Week has been productive and traumatic at the same time. I'm editing a horror film, and
Yeah.
in doing that, my computer crashed, and so mentally I'm going crazy. But it gave me time to write. So I had to. So I'm writing out of fear and all kinds of stuff.
Sure.
So I actually had what I wanted to write. I had three ideas that I wanted to do, and I kind of knew in my mind what I was going to do. And so the one that I picked, I said, okay, that's a harder film. So let me do that. So, you and Jeff could look at it and rip it apart and say, okay, do it this way. Not
Yeah.
that you would do that, but
No.
but so it's been productive. So I finished the 10 questions because I had time to not edit. The 10 questions, the 363, the characters. So I had time to do all that to know where I was kind of going. And of course you corrected me. You said, Bob, one sentence, quit giving me all that writing shit. So or quit being so verbose or whatever. So I said, okay, let me go back. And I wasn't sure if I should send the new cut down 363 or I didn't want to overwhelm.
So yeah, definitely send it for next week's office hours, and we'll like tear into it a bit. That'll be fun.
Okay, cool. So it's been productive.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear it. Martha, wrap us up. How's your week been?
This was a very challenging boot camp for me, and I felt like I definitely signed up for boot camp. So it was overwhelming at times, and then there were some breakthroughs, and especially talking with you helped. And some of the things that you also shared were, I'm gonna look at my notes, be okay with not liking my character too much, which really helped me create the misbehavior, because I was like, but I don't want her to be looked at as someone incapable or unprofessional. I mean, no woman would ever do that. Mine's based on the military. So, of course, women have a lot to prove anyway.
Yeah.
And then if I set her up to be a total, can I say this out loud? DICK, then
Sure.
that doesn't help women who are trying to show that they have a right to be there because they've earned it. So anyway, so that helped. And I love how you also said, and I'm saying this because I think this might help everybody because I had a struggle with it. And then what am I trying to say about her misbehavior and put that through the lens of her character, which was wonderful for me because this whole process is a whole new way of thinking, and I'm really excited about it, but I find it very hard. And I feel as far as getting through the week one exercises, I probably was a failure because I didn't even get to the 363. I didn't have 50 brainstorming ideas. And then I started reading ahead because I'm like, I need to understand what the heck I'm supposed to be doing here.
Yeah.
So I got confused by all the words and directions in the workbook, and then I discovered my questions for when you want to answer or get to it was, am I brainstorming scenes for Act Two, or is it for everything? And then I thought, well, I'm not going to waste time if this is all supposed to be Act Two and I'm brainstorming for all three acts.
Yes.
So, and then I read some things were saying Act Two, what was it? And then Part One. So I'm like, well, is Part One Act One? I was just getting all wrapped up in trying to really understand before I invested too much effort. And I wanted to be efficient, and I found myself not being very efficient. But I don't think I wasted any
Nope.
effort. I was really trying hard, but I didn't get as far as I wanted. And there were other things, of course. Everybody has stuff going on in their lives.
That's totally fair. I think it's great. And yeah, like I said to Bo, I will be going over some 363 stuff. So if there's other questions that arise when I'm going through that, jump on in. I love answering questions. I'll take this moment. It's so fun that I get to say this to everyone. Yeah, what I said to Martha, I think rings true for almost everyone. We write our protagonists. They're often related to something that we've been through or going through or we're really empathetic towards. And I think it's so important that when you're thinking about how you're going about, I mean, from your premise line through your 363, through your like 50/50s and your scene outline, all of that, I would encourage you all to most likely like your main character a little bit less. And really all I mean by that is just like give yourself permission to not have their problems or the thing that they're resolving be thrust upon them, but instead be of their own volition, of their own making. Because that's how we're going to see them grow. Otherwise, we're really just seeing somebody go through plot stuff, Oh, I would be a great employee, but my boss is such a shithead. And really, like the entire movie is just, well, if he quits his job and gets a new job, problem solved. Like, I don't know why I need to watch an hour and a half of a guy just getting beat down at a job. You know what I mean? So it's like that kind of thing where it's like, well, no, he has to grow in his responsibilities towards a company, whatever it may be, right? Like if you're thinking about it from that perspective, now you could still have the shithead boss that helps justify why this guy isn't a good, employee. But yeah, make sure that it's not just they're responding to the impetus. They're not just again, I didn't take that much improv, but man, I think there's so much that we can learn from like improv as writers, like the pinch and the ouch. It's okay that you have a pinch in scenes that causes the character to have an ouch, to have a response, but make sure that most of what we're watching is the ouch, not most of it is the pinch. The boss can be awful, but we want to see the character responding to the awful boss. We don't need to watch an awful boss over and over again. So there's just some things to think about. But yeah, let me jump in. I love checking in with everybody. I know that could be a little bit long, so thank you for all taking all that in with me. And hopefully you guys got to start to learn from each other a little bit. So yeah, let's review well, let me start it this way. Any like big I feel like we talked a whole bunch, so probably not. No one feel pressured. But any big questions that are not like going to be directly like, yeah, Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to have clarity on when the exercises are saying brainstorm the 50/50 and then break it down to the dynamic character 2020 and then the opponent 2020.
Yeah,
Is this across all three acts, or are we, because I thought we were
sure.
focusing on Act Two, and then I thought, well, maybe we're not.
It is, I wouldn't, okay, because I know you're working from source material to a degree. Uh, you probably have a little bit more of a structure in mind. The short answer is it should be throughout your entire project. It's not just any one act. Um, I think for most people, they don't know where these scenes, the idea for these scenes will like live. So I don't know if that's as big of an issue for most people. So I would say, I'm mostly saying that to say, attack it as though you don't already know your structure. I think part of that is for you personally, and this is maybe something that we could visit a little bit more during office hours, because I don't know if anyone else is really working off of source material. Maybe Bobby a little bit. I know you're kind of, or this is a new project, so maybe not.
Yeah, this is yeah.
But yeah, so what I would say is if you want to visit this a little bit deeper, you might surprise yourself if you allow yourself permission to not adhere to a specific structure that you've already pre-built in your mind.
Yes, I do understand that, and I'm already discovering new things that I would want to include in this that are not in the source material.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm more about what boxes this go in terms of where we are in week one. So if I go back to do the brainstorm of the 50/50, you're saying do it
Yeah.
across the entire project.
Yeah, so part of it is, think about it this way, right? If we're thinking about like the main character's misbehavior, you're going to identify the misbehavior, and then you're going to have multiple scenes where they're going to kind of be potentially at different phases of their
Okay.
stage in their misbehavior, right? Now, some of that might not be as true, right? Because you're doing 50/50s for other character traits as well, potentially. Likely it shouldn't be 50 scenes and 50 windows that are only into one thing, which is misbehavior. So they might not change as much throughout those scenes and windows, depending on what you're showcasing. And I think the flip side of that is, especially even if you do have source material, you really don't know where those ideas will land because they're not the things you're as committed to, right? The story you're telling is the journey through a misbehavior, and therefore, like, if the misbehavior is if it's Shrek and we're showcasing how someone has to grow from actively rejecting people for self-preservation purposes. Well, the fact that he's a burping, farting, gross, ogre, we might have different aspects of his growth. Like his burp is going to be so repugnant that it's repulsive that it's going to propel an opponent away. I don't know where that burp is going to lay in the movie, but at the same time, it kind of doesn't. It's a good window into showcasing how disgusting he is. I don't know where that's going to be relevant for my movie, right?
Okay.
And that's a window into showing disgustingness. So think about it that way too, even for yourself, but for everyone, I think it's an opportunity.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other? Yeah, Glenn, jump in.
Yeah, I guess it's probably a two-part question. One is, I think the Shakespeare in Love example that you had in there was really useful for me. Do you find, when I was going into like the 50/50s and the character breakdowns and that kind of thing, the 363, I kind of found myself wanting to look at examples of other things. Like, do you have examples that we can work off of? And I guess the related question is, would you encourage us to look at other examples, or is that distracting?
Yeah, it's a great question and I could see you spent at least a little bit of time thinking about this because it feels like you already kind of have an answer in a way. So yeah, we do have some other examples. We typically, especially for basic training, try not to give those out, largely because you guys are kind of going through a learning process. And what we've discovered over time is if you give people too many examples, they'll often just kind of start to mimic the examples rather than kind of go through creative discovery and growth. And so we don't want too much of that. We want to give like an example. And of course, the danger is the flip side is you might go, oh, well, that's the example I have to go by. So let me kind of adhere to that. So if you find yourself kind of going a little too down that rabbit hole, reach out to us. We could probably find another couple of examples for you to like look at. But I would really encourage you to, I would encourage you to really think about, and I actually have this example up because we're going to be going over the 15-part checklist on the page before. What's being accomplished in this example, and not so much trying to mimic the example or like look at it for its actual perfectionness, if that makes like even in a way I would argue, Wright rehearses Romeo and Juliet while conducting secret affair. In some ways, if I got this premise line, I'd almost go, do we need Wright and rehearses? Do we need Romeo and Juliet versus like a play? And we can cut a word. And then could we maybe define conducting secret affair a little bit more? And maybe the answer is no, right? Like maybe it's working as is. But I think that you can even ask questions of this example for as good as it is. It's very concise. It gets us down to 47 words. There are certain aspects of it, the fact that we do have like Shakespeare, who is a known entity involved in all this, right? Like versus like for your features, you shouldn't be using names. So it kind of gets away with some stuff that like you wouldn't necessarily get away with. And we also get other details that help move the secret affair along. So, any one part of this you could ask a question to, but you start to play the game of like, if we keep down this, the young woman is disguised as a male actor and they're keeping up a secret affair, right? So those two phrases working together make it more specific in a way that therefore the secret affair feels a little bit more validated, especially because, it's a period piece. If you know the history of Shakespeare, you know that like women weren't a part of Shakespearean plays early on, right? Like, so there's certain aspects of this where you could start to build out and go, well, we're getting more detail from the whole than the sum of its parts. But also we wanted to break it down for you guys so that you're able to kind of see the parts themselves and how we got to that premise line. But again, you kind of play this game of like any one example could throw you, because if you're trying to copy one aspect of it, like if you were just like, well, if I look at the adventure of Romeo and Juliet in this example, he uses the word secret affair. Why can't I use that framing and phrasing? And it's like, well, but you're missing these other two chunks that make the secret affair a little bit more specific and intentional. So it's stuff like that where sometimes you give too much, people kind of start to use what works in their favor and don't see the things that work against them in the bigger picture. But again, if you need another couple of examples, reach out. I think, and this is my take, I think that everyone is better off learning through the process of trial and failure, receiving notes, receiving feedback, kind of receiving their own being pushedness, than trying to kind of mirror what they're seeing and hoping that works. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other quick, Bobby? I saw a hand to start to go.
Yeah, I have a quick question about the misbehavior.
Yeah.
How far left can I go? I see where I want to go with the arc. So,
Yeah.
like in the professional, he was a killer. And so, how much can we love a killer? I just wanted to know how far negative can we go with you want to love your lead character. So, so I like mine starts off as a petty thief ripping off the general public. But he has to get some kind of my dynamic character actually changes him. But I just want to know how far I can go initially before I lose the audience. Like, I hate that guy for ripping off that lady.
Yeah, I think okay. So let me jump into the start of the 15-part premise line checklist, because I think this is literally leading right into the first aspect of it, which is main character's misbehavior. Right. And this is on page 38. If you guys want to kind of follow along, I'm going to be cheating because I don't have all 15 parts memorized. So I'm just going to be going down the list as well. So it might be helpful. And And so, yeah, this is actually, where I wanted to naturally start off. I think misbehavior, and I've had this conversation with several of you, is a lot of what your story's about.
Mhm.
And so to start off, like I said to Martha, like your main character a little less. Maybe Bobby, you're already kind of in that place of liking your character so, little in terms of not being precious of affording them every opportunity to be loved, that you're questioning the opposite side. And so, to start off, you want to start to think about what's the misbehavior? What are they actively doing that I could showcase them growing from, right? Now, the opposite side of that is, how do I mitigate it so they're not just a terrible person? And so I brought up Shrek kind of briefly, and I think that Shrek's actually one of the easiest examples for me personally to kind of break down. So hopefully you guys have all seen Shrek, right? He actively pushes everyone away from him in this world out of self-preservation because they reject him. Historically, he's grown up in a world where he's been rejected by Duloc and the citizens. And so therefore he grew into the ogre that they viewed him as and became the big scary guy who pushes everyone away and rejects everyone, right? But I think that the fact that it's out of self-preservation, that mitigating factor, is why we like Shrek. If everyone wanted to be Shrek's friend and Shrek was just a total jerk, we wouldn't want to follow Shrek. We wouldn't like Shrek. We wouldn't relate to Shrek unless you're truly a horrible person, right? But we've all felt some iteration of rejection in our lives and been like, but I'm a good person. I don't deserve to be rejected in this sort of way. Like, I don't understand, you know what I mean? And that's the connection that we have when, we don't all have to be big green ogres. I'm looking at all of you, none of us are, right? Like, but you know what rejection feels like, and you know that feels badly when it feels undeserved. And here you are on the other side going, I could root for this guy because I understand I might be in a situation where I would reject people before they could reject me out of some self-preservation. We're seeing, frankly, I mean, Shrek was ahead of its time in some ways. We're seeing a lot of that in culture now kind of come to the forefront, right? So it speaks very specifically to a lot of different, people out there in the world who maybe feel like I need to, especially coming out of the pandemic, like I need to have some self-preservation for myself. I can't always be giving myself at the expense of others. And I'm not saying that should be your mitigating factor for everything. I'm just saying I think that you could make someone do something truly jerky, like just being somebody who actively rejects people and does so in a way that is intentionally like scary and mean. As long as we understand why they're doing it and can understand why that makes sense for a character to do so. So, I mean, in some ways, like my gut reaction to your specific, and this is something we can talk about more in office hours if you want to send it in for this week. So we don't get too bogged down in any one example. I don't even know if being a petty thief is a misbehavior. You look at like Les Mis, and I don't think that being a thief is kind of like it's incidental to the story. It's a part of like I need to survive. But like if you're not somebody who would in the grand question of would you steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family, I don't think there's a misbehavior. I mean, there's a moral quandary, but I don't think there's a misbehavior there. If your family is going to die, it's yeah, like what else are you gonna do? You're not gonna let your family die. I don't even think it's a misbehavior of sorts. Now, maybe your character isn't stealing for that reason, and we can kind of evaluate that a little bit more. But I would actually challenge you to think about is there a deeper personal like a character trait that leads to the stealing, and the stealing is actually just the action that showcases part of the misbehavior rather than being the misbehaviors itself. And you might have been shorthanding it just for the sake of this conversation. That's okay too.
Right.
But I'm just saying, like, think about, and this is a good example for everyone. So take this as a learn through osmosis moment. The actions that you are going to have your character do in the movie, in the script, should showcase the character trait that is a misbehavior. You know what I'm saying? Like the act of rejection that Shrek showcases is the misbehavior. The fact that he, does bad things to Donkey early on, as well as other characters throughout as we watch those scenes. Those are the actual actions, but it's really the act of rejection for self-preservation that is his misbehavior. And so I would kind of encourage you all to think about and I wrote this down. I forget who asked a question about it, or at least asked a question that made me start to think about it. When you're thinking about your misbehavior, especially if you're a premise line, I would almost I like to add this step to it, which is write out a more complete sentence to your misbehavior that can't necessarily fit into the premise line because it would be a little too long. Should still be a single sentence, but it's a little too long. And then shrink it down to a couple of words that you're using as key indicators for that misbehavior so that it fits into the rest of the premise line. And the reason for that is, I see Brian, I'll get to you in a second. The reason for that, I think, is it's very easy. Like if I just said Shrek rejects people, blah, 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 for the rest of my premise line, there's so many different ways that someone could reject people. There could be so many reasons why someone rejects people, right? It's not telling a lot. And if you stop at just rejects, you might not really nail your premise line because you're not focusing on all these aspects of what constitutes a misbehavior. But if you kind of write out that full sentence, I think you'll see that some of that information bleeds into what's my second, like already the fact that I've added for Shrek that everyone else already rejects him, and that's why he acts this way, right? Well, what do we see in the first half of the movie? We see Donkey accept those blows and still throw absolute friendship and kindness at Shrek, right? We see Princess Fiona, I think they get together before the midpoint, right? Also kind of throwing kindness. Now we don't know her secret that she's also an ogre, but she's also throwing kindness at Shrek. So Shrek is being constantly thrown niceness and people wanting to be around him. And that's what allows him to lessen his misbehavior around the people that we're watching him engage with. He can bring down his guard a bit, right? And so if we start writing out that second act adventure in the premise line, well, we're probably going to start to identify phrases like through friendship with Donkey and Princess Fiona, right? We're gonna start to identify those things. We're gonna go, oh, I could see the connective tissue there, right? And so give yourself a little bit longer of a misbehavior to see how it feeds into the rest of your premise line, and then start to use the shortened phrasing of, rejects for the sake of, shortening a premise line. Brian, what's going on? What'd that spark for you?
I did this. That's how I worked my premise line during the week. So I wrote out kind of almost like a free-form thought of kind of what I was trying to hit in the premise line for the misbehavior, and then the relationship between the dynamic character and the main character. And it's probably worth noting, I used ChatGPT to kind of like shrink it down and ask for like different words or to describe like the gearing of the sentence, essentially the mechanics of it. And then once I kind of started to see the mechanics, then I was able to kind of like shrink it down like you were talking about. I guess the follow-up would be like, is that an appropriate way to use ChatGPT as like a co-pilot? But is it the right time to ask that, or is that something different?
You could ask that. I mean, look, I think ChatGPT is look, I'll spend 2 seconds on it because I think it's my personal opinion at this point, not any sort of like professional consensus. What I would suggest is utilize ChatGPT like a tool, like you would maybe like a Google or something like that, right? If you're using it to really kind of be like, come up with ideas for my blah, 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 or whatever it is, right? You can do whatever you want. Like, who am I to stop you? But I would say, like, I don't think that you're going to get the most creative feedback from ChatGPT, right? It is literally meant, it is a tool that is meant for maybe some for more like this, where it's like, all right, I have these 50 words. How would you condense it down into like 7 efficient words? and see what happens. And I think that's fair. Like I'll give you guys a quick anecdotal story. I had a friend from my grad school who mentioned that he put his scripts into ChatGPT for like feedback and stuff like that. And of course, my brain went, I never thought about that. I didn't even, at the time, I don't even think I knew that you could put attachments into ChatGPT. So I was like, all right, like let me throw one of my scripts in. I'm just curious what would happen, right? So I threw a comedy pilot that I had completed into it. And it's funny because it found all of these moments in it, like really, it was like, this script is great. It gave like a lot of nice feedback, but like it was like it could be tighter. And I was like, okay, give me examples of like where it could be like tighter. And it was so funny because it found these moments where there were these comedic lines, beats, whatever. And it was like, well, you could cut this and it would be shorter. And I'd be like, I was like, yes, that is 100% true. It would be 12% more efficient, but it would no longer be funny. Like you've literally cut the joke part of the line or of the moment. So it's kind of like like I'm not going for most efficient. I'm going for most efficient while still being comedic. You know what I mean? So I would take everything. I see you, Martha. I'll get to you in a second. I would take everything with ChatGPT with like a grain of salt, but I'm not as opposed to I'm not somebody who's saying don't ever use it. I'm just saying use it very cautiously because it's it's not going to give you good creative output. It's only going to give you the creative output that you put into it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Martha. Yeah, what was that spark for you?
Um, so I'll try that, writing out the whole sentence or a longer sentence that wouldn't fit in the premise line.
Yeah.
I was under the impression that the premise line does not include the growth. Like the end result was she was able to do blah, blah, blah. Is that
Correct.
right?
Okay, so yes and no.
Huh.
And so it doesn't literally, we're not including the growth in the third act. But the reason we're not including it is because if you really write a efficient and like solid premise line, it's because the growth is obvious, right? Like if we continue with the concept of Shrek, it wouldn't, I mean, like it'd be kind of a dumb movie if he doesn't grow to accept people into his like life. Like what did we watch if he just goes back to being a mean old grumpy ogre, right? So I don't need to tell you that because by saying he starts off rejecting people and through his friendships with Donkey, he blah 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 blahs, the obvious outcome is the growth. So it's not that we're not telling it, it's that it should kind of be self-evident through the other work that you're doing. Does that make sense?
I think that's really hard to do.
I mean, look, and that's also why I'm saying, I think, and Bobby, I see, I'll get to you in a second. I think that's what I'm saying is give yourself the permission to not necessarily succeed right now in doing like, again, I'm picking a movie in Shrek that, I mean, shit, you take a movie from Disney or any of those places. I mean, I have one friend who's a writer who's like, the best thing a writer can literally do is watch Disney movies because they are literally, and someone I saw wrote Aladdin in here as well, like they're movies that are meant for younger minds, but they're still story forward stories, right? They're still telling stories. They're not just shapes and colors being thrown at you. They are deep stories. So the efficiency of those stories are incredible. So I'm kind of cheating by picking Shrek and you know like it's not as nuanced. It's almost more brilliant because it's not as like nuanced and it has to kind of be that efficient. But most movies that you pick, unless you really kind of pick a bad movie, you could do this for. But you're on the other side of your writing journey than those movies are. Those movies went through these types of decisions, writing, rewriting, notes from everyone under the sun. And then they were made, and then they had editors come in who were also storytellers in their own right. Right. So it's gone through a lot of iterations to get to that level of perfection where I can then, you know, retroactively look at it and create a very easy premise line. You're on the other side where you have to make a whole bunch of creative decisions. So you're probably not going to do as good of a job as I could do for Shrek. Largely because one, I know these exercises better than you, and two, because Shrek is a completed movie and you're at the start of your journey. So I have two really big cheats that you don't have. So yeah, that's okay that it's not as easy as I'm making it sound. Bobby, yeah, jump in.
Yeah, I just had a question about something Martha said early on. She said that one of her characters, and maybe the lead character, was the appearance of a person who had, she was a dick or whatever the person
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
And so how long do you think that person can be in that space before you lose the audience?
I
Do you
don't
have a set amount of time?
There's no set amount of time. I think that, okay, so I'll give you my analogy is great. I'll jump into my analogy that I love to give, and you'll all get it, and I'll probably wind up saying it to at least half of you again during office hours at some point. When I think about misbehavior, I think that most writers fall into this trap, and we see this a lot when people are really struggling with what a second act is. I think that a lot of writers kind of think of misbehavior almost like an on-off like light switch, right? Like you're a dick until you're not. It's on until it's off, right? And the analogy I give is it's more like a dimmer switch. So throughout the journey, we're progressively watching your character change little by little, right? The light is slowly being turned on or off, it's being moved that way. And so what I want you to think about is, if I'm giving a more direct answer to your question, probably throughout most of the first act, they are going to be within whatever their misbehavior is at its fullest, because you're going to have some setup event that then triggers their second act adventure where they start to have that change.
Mhm.
How long into that second act adventure they are a certain way in their misbehavior, it's that dimmer switch. You might be at 45% pretty quickly and then live there for a little bit because of the way that your plot breaks down, or maybe they're on the, it's one of those things where there's not an exact science to where somebody will be at any one time. There's a general structure that we would follow, right? So that setup event is probably going to get them into that journey that moves them forward. As we get into the first half of the second act, they're going to be kind of having some growth. Most likely, we're going to get to some second act complication. I'll go over this a little bit more in the 363, so don't feel so compelled as I'm barreling through it to write this down. But we'll see them kind of revert back to their misbehavior in the back half of that second act adventure. And then we'll get to some low point in battle scene that will kind of thrust them into the ultimate change that we see, right? So there's that broad structure that we're working from, but where they are on page 47 in relation to their misbehavior, it's
Mhm.
loose. You know what I mean? So think about it that way. And frankly, you could have change in their first act. I mean, they could be getting deeper into it. Like I think about something like Groundhog's Day, and I feel like Bill Murray gets like deeper into his misbehavior just by the nature of having to go to Puxatawny or wherever the groundhog is, right? Like the fact that we see him kind of start off big city-ish and be like, I'm a big guy, I'm a big city guy and a big city kind of importance. And then we see him like enter into this small town where I think he's from because he knows some of the locals before the movie even starts. You're like, oh, he's like an even bigger jerk than I realized when he was with his, big city TV people, right? So, I mean, in some ways you think you're starting at 100%, and then you're like, oh, wait, that was only 85%. And now when that guy's excited to see him, he's even more of a jerk. So yeah, so different things. I wouldn't say that's the norm, but I think that does happen. And even if we go back to Fifth Element, just because it's still on my mind, I think in some ways, I don't think the setup event is necessarily him running into Mila Jovovich, but I do think that in some ways we see a certain kindness from a guy who's you know, I'll say a jerk just for the sake of it. It's been forever since I've seen the movie. And like he kind of helps out this woman and is it because she's an attractive woman who's most of the way naked? Maybe. Is it because he's actually kind of a kinder guy than we realize? Maybe. Time will kind of tell. You know what I'm saying? So maybe it's the fact that he feels unrelated to this futuristic world and he sees this woman who similarly feels that way in this moment and he sees a bit of himself in her. Maybe it's all of those things, right? But he becomes a little bit less of a jerk before the setup event really kind of thrusts him into the world, which is he actually gets stuck with her. I forget exactly how he gets stuck with her, but he's actually like, you know, he can ditch her and he chooses not to. So yeah. Does that make sense? And I spent a
Yes.
little bit more time on misbehavior because I think that's probably the biggest thing in this checklist that I want you guys to make sure you're hammering home. Second act adventure too. Um, we talk about Jeff calls it the quartet field, which is theme, misbehavior, battle scene, and second act adventure. And so those are the ones we're really going to be focusing on. I'll spend a little bit more time as we get to each of them, but those are like the big ones. Main character stage of life, I'm not gonna spend too much time on it. I think the biggest thing to take away from it is it's not just being 18, being, you know what I mean, like that kind of thing. The thing that I would really challenge you to think about when it comes to main character stage of life is how does their stage of life impact the journey they're going on? I don't think it's that important to focus on age or even like gender unless their gender plays a role into the journey they're going to go on or like any like single character they're still living at home with their parents. Okay, that could be a setting more than it is a stage of life unless the growth we're going to see is something about leaving the nest or having to take care of your parents when really they should be taking care of you or what I mean, something like that. So think about how it relates to the journey, not so much the literal time of life. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Great. Dynamic character. I know I've had this conversation with a couple of people already. We write here that it's the person that they spend most of the story, the middle of the story with, and that is for the most part true. But the way that I would think about it more than that is this is the character that helps the main character change in their misbehavior, right? It's the person that is kind of accepting of their misbehavior to a degree, maybe even to a fault. Maybe they have a dynamic estrangement when they stop accepting their misbehavior, but it's the person that is engaging with the misbehavior most of all and kind of trying to help your main character change in their journey, right? So like again, if we keep picking on Shrek, it's the fact that Donkey is befriending Shrek against all odds, against everything that he has, everything that Shrek is throwing at him. It's not so much just the fact that they are stuck together, right? That's what kind of constitutes him as the dynamic character. The dynamic manipulation is essentially so like these two I would kind of put in the same like yeah, Dr. Melfi. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And TV works like a little bit differently just because I don't know how many people have seen The Sopranos, hopefully most people. You know what? Look, I don't know where people are at these days. I'll throw her under the bus. I hear on the other side my girlfriend does not watch all The Sopranos, although she did the other day say to me, "Didn't we not finish The Sopranos? We need to get back to that." So,
You got to keep her.
well, yeah, exactly. It's one of her best traits is wanting to watch The Sopranos. Yeah, Tony doesn't spend most of his time with Dr. Melfi, but she definitely helps him grow. TV works a little bit differently because we might have a different dynamic character for a different episode. In a movie, we typically have one dynamic character, although I gave the example of Lady Bird earlier, where the mother is the main dynamic character, but she does need some help from like the best friend. So we have a proxy dynamic character, which I'm not gonna spend any real time. Brian, go ahead.
Does the growth have to be positive or negative or just or unjust, or is it just growth in the direction that you need it to go?
Sure,
Like, because
sure.
some characters are a catalyst for like the main character to become worse.
Yeah, and
But I
so
was
I think
thinking kind of broadly.
it depends on the story you want to tell, right? Like the most iconic version of this, I know it's TV, is Breaking Bad, right? It's I'm turning Mr. Chips into Scarface. It was very famously Vince Gilligan's catchphrase, right? And so it can be a negative growth arc, um, but it's not the traditional storytelling thing, but yeah, if you're going for a negative growth arc, you can totally go that way. I have not seen Marty Supreme yet, so I don't have that answer for you.
Oh, you got to see it.
It's
It's
on
great.
I know it's on my list. Also, just I'm a diehard Knicks fan, and I know Timothy Chalamet is a diehard Knicks fan, so I have to go out and support my fellow Knicks fan just on that alone. But it does look really good. I haven't gotten a chance to see it. I'll report back when I do get to see it though, Glenn. Um, so yeah. So anyway, I did want to say if anyone does think that is if anyone is thinking about having like a proxy dynamic, Martha, I think we started to go down this road, although I might not have used that phrasing because I know you kind of had a couple of different people in that story. We can talk about it more in office hours. I would encourage you to try not to do that. But if it naturally happens, it's something we can kind of work through. I think sometimes people like knee jerk to having proxies. Uh, and then it's really just an excuse to not make optimal decisions and instead just have more stuff happen. So I wanted
What's a
a
proxy dynamic?
like a proxy dynamic or proxy opponent is if like so in Lady Bird, right? The best friend is Lady Bird's proxy dynamic because Lady Bird mistreats her while she's trying to become more popular with people in the school or like whatever she's kind of going through. And like Marion, who's really the person that is Lady Bird's dynamic character in that story, can't be in school, right? She's her mother. She's not going to be in school with her. She's not, being an adult and getting rejected by your teenage daughter is not the same as your best friend in high school rejecting you, especially if you're kind of if I remember correctly, I feel like the best friend is kind of a little bit of a, for lack of a better term, like loser in the school. So to lose her only friend is really kind of undermining of her. So, it's a person who represents the opponent or the dynamic character when the dynamic character opponent can't be present for one reason or another. But I do want to discourage that even though I'm the one bringing it up, I want to discourage that a little bit just for the sake of oftentimes people use it as an excuse to make episodic material rather than, kind of be productive and go, well, I've put myself into this situation, right? I've made a situation where Lady Bird has to go to high school, and there's just no world where her mom is going to be in high school with her without it turning into a weird Billy Madison movie. So I have to create a best friend, right? But yeah, so just kind of be a little cautious of that. So yeah, I want to connect dynamic character, dynamic manipulation, which is to say that, the dynamic manipulation is just kind of what I've already said. How the main character is engaging with how the dynamic character is engaging with the main character along the journey to help them grow. It's also probably a person that the main character will be showcasing their misbehavior with the most. It's probably the person that will empathize with as we see the main character do whatever they're doing and needing to grow from. Does that make sense? So those two kind of going together. Start of the adventure, right? So we have, that the stuff that leads us into a setup to go into the actual second act adventure of this story. Yes, Martha.
Does could there be a prologue that helps with a setup, or is that a more of a cheat, it sounds like at this point?
Do you mean prologue as in like uh
Oh, some
there was a
movies
time before, or do you just mean
like
yeah.
like 2 months earlier, and there's a scene that got us to boom, the
Well, I
location where
mean,
the adventure
I
begins.
yeah, I mean, I would think about like what you're showing in the first, like the start of the adventure is not the page one of your script.
Okay.
So yeah. So you're setting. This is more like we use the phrase like setup. So it's kind of where your act one breaks into act two,
Oh, okay.
right? So you're getting a prologue in the sense of the stuff you're laying down in act one.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
Thanks.
So, and this is kind of identifying both. It's like what's happening before that lets us understand why the adventure's happening, who the characters are in the adventure. But yeah, you want to start on that adventure.
Thanks.
What do characters actually do in the second act, right? So this is kind of referencing plot stuff. This is probably a lot of where your early 50/50s and 2020s are going to be coming from. What are these characters literally physically doing? Um, And it's one of those things I would start to, you want to think about how they're engaging. I think that this can kind of go in with dynamic progression, which is the next one, which is, how their relationship progresses throughout the second act adventure. And so you're kind of thinking about like not only what they're doing, but why they're doing it, how they're engaging with each other. I'm going to go over this a little bit more when I go over 50/50s in a second. And really, I'm going to be going over scenes versus windows for everyone. I think there was a question from somebody about that. So I'll be talking a little more about scenes. But basically, it's not just the what are they doing? Brad and Martha are talking, but rather how the characters are engaging and why they're engaging is really important. So I'll come back around to that though. But that kind of comes from this. Um, Sense of jeopardy, right? So we've all heard the phrase stakes. It's just what are the stakes? And I would encourage you all to think about what are the emotional stakes more than the literal stakes, right? I definitely said this to a couple of people. We know your main character in a movie is not going to die. So being like, well, Goldfinger has a gun to James Bond's head. It's like, yeah, those aren't really stakes. We know James Bond is going to get away, right? Like we know your character is going to get away. So start to think about what are the emotional stakes is what I would kind of challenge you. It could be, you have a sense of physical stakes too, but I like to think about it that way. Third party opponent motive. Uh, you know, the big takeaway that I really like to emphasize with third party opponent and their motive is there's a knee jerk for a lot of newer writers to go, well, if my protagonist, if my main character is a good guy, then my opponent is a bad guy who is inherently doing bad things to my main character. And what I would kind of challenge you to think about is, can you make a more authentic bad guy, right? Like, most people don't think of themselves as the bad guy. Uh, they're probably doing things for their own reason, and their own reason is justifiable. So I would almost kind of think of the opponent as in opposition to the main character, not necessarily bad for the sake of being bad. So the more you can like layer in an authentic human being into that opponent, the better your story is gonna be, just by the nature of your not making it so like obvious. There's a limitation to the Disney movies. It's that usually the bad guy is kind of bad almost for the sake of it. Although if you look at something like The Lion King, right? Scar is the second son who's always kind of overlooked, and Mufasa is the like beloved one by all the community, and so he kind of kills his brother to gain that positioning. I think there's something to be said for like there's a little bit of depth there. I don't know if like Lord Farquaad in Shrek is really as justifiable. He's kind of a bad guy for the sake of being a bad guy. But I think in most movies you don't necessarily have that going on. So think about your opponent not as a bad guy. It'd be like an interesting exercise that I think that people can not spend a lot of time on doing is like if if your opponent was the main character of this story and your main character was the opponent, could you justify that story at least to a degree? And if you can't, maybe you need to spend more time thinking about how your opponent can be a more authentic person. So that's my 2 cents there. Second act complications. This is the middle of your second act, but I want you to think about more than just a single scene. So if we think about that dimmer switch, right? Your character is probably getting the closest to resolving their misbehavior right before they get to whatever this complication is. And that complication is going to feed the rest of your second act through your low point, and kind of have them start to likely revert back to their misbehavior. So when you think about a complication, don't just factor in like, Billy's mom says, she's like leaving. And then that's just like a scene idea that kind of creates a more complicated situation. It's, well, now Billy rejects this thing that he was growing toward, whatever it may be, right? So think about it more for the sense of, 25, 30 pages in the back half of your second act, rather than just a single scene or a single concept that complicates your story. How does it complicate the misbehavior? How does it force your main character to start to revert? So in Shrek, it's when he overhears Princess Fiona talking about Lord Farquaad and thinking that he's the one that's being talked about, and therefore goes back to his ways of rejecting people before they could reject him, right? It's that kind of concept. So he starts to reject, he runs away, he does all of his stuff. Opponent obstacles. So, this is one of those things where it's just, what is the opponent doing that creates an obstacle in your main character's life? How are they actively kind of just creating more struggle for your main character? It's a good way of thinking about scene ideas that, if we think about that pinch and ouch from improv, it's a little bit of that pinch that creates an ouch for your main character. I would suggest, I think that writers often knee jerk to this. It's like an easy thing of like, well, I could have the opponent do more stuff, and the main character always has to respond to it. So this one, I think it's important to have an overarching idea of who your opponent is and how they might create obstacles for your main character, but I wouldn't spend too much time. I would spend more time on all the stuff that came before this than the opponent obstacles specifically, because I think you are probably naturally doing that to the point that you need to. There are very few writers that are underdoing this one. Main character stakes, right? So it's this is kind of the question of like, why do we care about your main character? So besides just mitigating the misbehavior, I kind of need to care about something else in the world. Like the example that I love to give for this is Three Billboards Over Ebbing. I don't think that we would actually care about Frances McDormand and her journey if it wasn't for the son, even though the son is barely present in the movie, right? She's lost her daughter and she feels responsible because she was one that made her daughter walk alone that night. But through her action of needing revenge in this small town where everyone knows your business, and she's literally plastering it on billboards over here, she's effectively losing her son because he's kind of being thrust into this world of being embarrassed by his mom and having to kind of like reject her to this small town and kind of stand in opposition of what she wants for his own like well-being. So, if she wasn't losing her son because she lost her daughter, we wouldn't really care about the journey as much. Even though, again, the son I think he's in it for like 4 scenes. You know what I mean? He's essentially like a background character for all intents and purposes. But I think that those stakes are really important. Genre, I think this is a pretty easy one overall, right? If you're doing a comedy, make it a comedy. If you're doing a drama, you want it to be kind of in the realm of a drama. The reason that it's part of this checklist is we should be able to start to understand what your genre is from the way that your sentence is phrased. So this is not saying put in like, I'm writing a comedy about, right? But if you're writing The Hangover, it should feel comedic. It shouldn't be like a man on the verge of missing his wedding endeavors to Las Vegas to, you know what I mean? Like, don't make it sound like it's a drama. That'd be kind of crazy. Like, it should be, 4 fucked up dudes go to Vegas to have a wild night before, Joe settles down, right? Like, okay, we get it. We get the genre. Thematic meaning and context. This is the last of the quartet fields. And it pays homage to like, what is again, you're not necessarily saying the theme, and to, go back to what Martha asked, you don't need to tell us what the outcome of the story is. There's similar genre where it's like, if you crush the rest of this, I should be able to go, oh, I know the theme of your story. I know the theme of Shrek. It's a person who is being rejected, working to overcome their need to protect themselves, to accept a community and come to terms with finding community and acceptance, right? That's the theme of that story. So if I do a good enough job in the rest of these fields, the theme should be self-evident, but you also want to keep that theme in mind as you're answering these things, so you're not just overly describing plot or losing kind of focus in the bigger scheme of things. And then lastly, fresh entertainment. What's the conceit of this project? how is it something we haven't seen before? That should start to appear here also, right? So if I say, you know, I'm writing a movie about a guy who joins the Top Gun Academy and he's a bit of a maverick, and you know what I mean? Like it's like, well, you're just describing Top Gun. Like I don't, you're not doing anything new that we haven't seen before. But if you start to subvert it in some way, that should start to appear because your movie is not going to be totally conceitful. It's going to pay homage to things that we have seen before, but you want to think about how it is different than those things that we've seen before. And if you start to layer that in as well, that'd be a great step forward. So that's the checklist. And we're going to go through people's premise lines as well. So we'll get to kind of play with some of these things thanks to the people who sent in their premise lines. Do I have any quick questions about anything that I kind of talked about here that we didn't get a chance to go into as I was going over it? Yeah, Brian.
I didn't get a chance to send in my premise line. Could I just send it in after class and or was that only for the people that volunteered? I guess I didn't understand that.
No, you could send it in for office hours. So send it over to me and we'll talk about it on Wednesday. But yeah, we're just gonna go over the people who sent it in for today. But honestly, like what I would say is what I always feel is it's great that people do this. I would encourage not only everyone else who's sitting here not having their premise line gone over, but especially the people whose premise line we are going over, almost pay more attention when I'm going over other people's material because you are going to have answers when I'm going over your stuff that when you see it in other people's material, you'll be like, oh, I'm seeing what Brad's missing. And it'll kind of help you learn through that osmosis. So I would encourage you to kind of take all of that in that way. Any other quick questions? Otherwise, we'll jump over to the 363 review. Great. Okay, so 363, I want to really emphasize, I don't know if anyone is doing TV, but we're only doing a 363 if we're doing features and we're doing books. TV writers, we're not doing you mildly zone out, but still pay attention. But yeah, you're not doing it for TV. The reason is we just don't have enough material in TV to justify doing a 363. But the 363 is essentially a blueprint to your entire project, right? And we're doing 12 sentences, and we're going to kind of walk you through all of that over the next couple of weeks. But basically, what you're doing is you're creating like a structure, like a blueprint or a map of how your character is navigating through this story structure, through essentially like their misbehavior and their interactions, right? That's the thing that I would say as you grow your 363, you want to primarily focus on. It is inherently going to start off as a thing that you are probably putting a lot of plot stuff in. So in week one, as you're thinking about your 50/50s, as you're thinking about some of your bigger tentpole types of scenes, that is probably going to be where you start to build your 363 from. I often encourage writers to be thinking about like your sequence 3, which is essentially your setup event, which gets you into the story. Your sequence 6, which is generally about where your second act complication is going to factor in, and sequence 9, which is where your like low point is going to start to hit, where you're going to have your character start to kind of journey back into their final moments. And then usually in sequence 11 or 12, you're going to have some type of battle scene, right? And so those are kind of the biggest tent poles in your movie that you want to start to think about. And they'll probably start off being a bit scene heavy, a bit plot heavy, and that's okay. You want to start to factor in. It's a good way of measuring, like, what does this mean for my main character? What do these moments mean? How does it show some type of growth? Even just looking at it, how are they in sequence 3 and sequence 6? How are they different, right? And it's kind of an interesting way of mapping that out. So you're going to start to fill in these 12 sentences. They should be single sentences. They can be a bit longer. And step one, you're probably going to just have one scene. But the thing to think about is they do kind of convey somewhere between 7 and 10 pages of material for each sequence, right? So if you're thinking about your story, 12 sentences make up 120 pages. We don't really do 120 pages as much anymore, so it's probably closer to 7 or 8 pages of material. But one scene is not going to be 7 or 8 pages. One scene is going to be somewhere between 1.5 and 3 pages. Maybe if you're overwriting at this early stage, 2 to 4 pages, right? So what we like to do is, as we start to get into sequence statements for the 363, start to write it out as like when, then, and until, right? Almost like a beginning, middle, and end of each sequence. And the reason we do this is inherently, by doing that, you kind of have to put in at least 3 scene ideas. Hopefully, you're kind of factoring it more from like a character growth perspective. So like uh, when Brad's nervous about when Brad's nervous about showcasing his knowledge of the exercises, then he then he studies the workbook and prepares for the class until he's put on the spot and has to teach everybody, right? Like it's like, okay, so I've kind of probably factored in almost like 4 scenes in a way, right? We're gonna have Brad start to study, and Brad's going to start to, maybe we even need a scene of like, how is Brad nervous? Well, he talks to his girlfriend about being nervous for the class and what, that kind of thing, right? So inherently, I've already kind of pre-baked in 3 or 4 scenes. So you could start to kind of factor that in as you work through your 363, right? So something I just want you to be thinking about the fact that you're going to be taking for the first week, the first exercise of your 363, you're going to be building 12 sentences. They might literally be 12 scenes, and that's okay. We want to grow from there into 12 more full sequences that should hopefully represent, 50, 60 scenes that constitute most of your story. And they'll also really help factor, like they'll help you focus what your scene outline is going to ultimately look like. And so the way they differ is so I'll give you a little bit of background into me. My undergrad was in finance. I was kind of a math kid growing up more than I was an English kid, writing or anything like that kid. And so the way I always kind of think of it is, those like math problems where it's like 3x plus 2y equals 32, right? I like to think of the sequence statement almost as like the 32. It's like that's the outcome that I want, and then the scenes will be the thing that I answer to showcase that I know this thing. So if I'm doing an even better example of my when, then, and until of Brad being nervous about teaching the class, I might start to try and build out that middle sequence, the middle of that sequence, to be more Brad prepares in a slew of ways that showcase that he really cares about this and needs to know everything about teaching until he blah, right? Like maybe that's not the best example of it, but you start to think about what kind of scenes might that involve. Well, maybe Brad gets a few friends together and teaches them earlier in the week, to a friendly audience where he doesn't have to worry about actually being on for his, for this class, right? So we could start to brainstorm different ideas that prove that thing. And so I like to kind of think of them a little bit differently in that sense. So think about that a little bit. And that's a little bit down the road thinking. For now, let's just start with the 12 scenes, but I just want you thinking about where you're going to. Glenn, yeah, I would say at this stage, literally, I mean, I frankly, even when I'm doing my 363, I don't know how to screen share. Like I literally have it like sitting, well, it's on my second screen, but like I'm starting on a new project and I literally, the first thing I do is I number 1 through 12 and I put when, then, until, and then I copy and paste all the way down the line. Uh, for my brain, I like to put like a space in between them. So I'll do like 1, when, then, until, empty space, 2, when, then, until, so that they're really segmented out. And yeah, I mean, I'll like, it's clunky. Like I wouldn't share it with somebody because it's like, when Brad, blah, 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 then, and then the then will almost inevitably like not fit particularly well. And then the until will really seem clunky as hell. So eventually you get to a place where you remove them. But to start, it's just a good way. It's also a good way of thinking of like it's a beginning, middle, and end of each sequence. So you don't want to necessarily be doing like uh when Brad's nervous for the class, then or if we remove the when then until like Brad's nervous for the class, Martha gives a call over and they talk about writing. Brad has some lunch and he has to prepare for the class, and you're kind of like, well, what was the like through line? I mean, maybe timeline wise that makes sense, but like, what's the through line of that sequence? How does that propel story? Those are just events that are happening. So the when, then, until is actually literally kind of making your brain go, when this happens, then it causes this thing to happen, and that thing happens until there's a conclusion that moves the story forward into the next when, right? Brad teaches the class successfully, right? And so then the next sequence starts when Brad goes to Jeff and brags about how great the class was. Then he demands a pay raise because he could be the best teacher, like that kind of, right? Like, feel free to tell Jeff I need a raise. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm saying like it's that kind of thing where it naturally feeds the next thing. So yeah, literally do that. Literally, I see Martha. I'll give me a second. Let me just finish this thought. Literally do that thing because it forces your brain into a storytelling, like concept versus just allowing yourself the freedom to be like, this thing happened. Because you're going to start from a plot-based place anyway. Like even my bad example here was plot-based. And the growth that we want to see you do is through more like character development of when Brad is forced to teach this class, then he gets over his nervousness in XYZ ways until he realizes he's a great teacher and should be blah blah blah, right? So it's now like my next iteration of it is showcasing personal growth rather than the like teaching of the class aspect of it, right? So that's like the even step above. Yeah, Martha, go ahead.
Thanks. So the 363 is for the entire feature, the entire
Yeah.
screenplay.
Yes. So you are so the way it is literally broken down, the reason why I use the numbers 3, 6, and 3 is it is 3 sequences for your first act, 6 for your second, and 3 for your third. So that is literally how you should be breaking it down.
Okay.
And again, that's kind of there so that writers don't overemphasize a first act, which is inevitably what they tend to do. So really kind of keep those numbers in mind. Keep it to 1 through 12, largely because when you send it over to me and we talk about it, a lot of writers knee jerk to going 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 1, 2, 3 again, and it becomes a nightmare because then I have to start to be like, okay, act 2, number 3, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. So keep it 1 through 12. It's also good because even though it is first act, second act, third act, it is still part of a bigger overall project. And sometimes starting from 1 again almost makes you feel like you are restarting in a way. So keep it 1 through 12, but it is literally first act, second act, third act. Yeah, Bobby, I think I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, do you inherently, in your when, then, and until, do you inherently put your then as the conflict?
There should be okay, so I'm gonna get into conflict a little bit more when we talk about scenes,
Okay.
but there should literally be conflict in everything you write. And something I'm glad I get to do this with all of you at once because now I don't have to do it individually. When I say conflict, I don't mean arguing. Most of the best conflict is not arguments. It's kind of like the worst thing you can like knee jerk to. It can happen, and sometimes it's worthwhile, but you want to try and like there should be conflict in what the characters want from each other or need in the moment, right? And that conflict can easily be something that people aren't necessarily fighting about, right? A guy and a girl sleep together on the first date, and the guy needs long-term commitment because he feels like whatever, you know what I mean? And the girl just got out of a bad breakup and really just wants the opportunity to find herself. So she doesn't want to commit to this guy. Well, we don't need to see an argument about that. It's probably more interesting if we see the guy start to be like, hey, do you want to like stay for breakfast? And she's like, no, I have girls going to brunch. And you know what I mean? Like, oh, okay, well, like, what are you doing like later this weekend? You know what I mean? Like, they're not arguing. It's really interesting to see a guy, a person pushing that agenda forward. And meanwhile, maybe that girl wants to see that guy again. She had a really good time, but because she knows that she wants to be free of herself and she knows that in her last relationship she immediately dove in, she doesn't want to acquiesce and say that she's available later that weekend. So she plays a little cool and there's conflict even within herself because, she likes him, and we'll maybe learn that in the next scene when she's at brunch with her friends. Or maybe there is no brunch, right? Maybe she goes home and she just cooks an egg with her cat, and she just said that as an excuse to get out of that situation because she knows she doesn't want to like overcommit. And we have a quirky independent rom-com where she's talking to her cat about how great the date was and how she can't fall into the same trappings. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing, right? And so there's always conflict in everything. But a different thing that made me want to say is the bulk of your sequence statement ultimately, and I don't mean at this early stage because I think your statements will be limited anyway, should live in the then portion of that sentence. That's where the majority, the when is essentially going to set up the then. It's the thing that, it's if we think about the 363, right? There's 6 sequences in the middle. Most of your story is happening in the middle of your story. It's essentially the same rule for a sequence statement, right? It's the majority of the mini story within the bigger story of a sequence statement is in the when portion in the middle of that story. We have one, maybe this is going to be a helpful analogy to you guys. We have one officer in project group who identifies it kind of like a Tootsie Roll, right? You kind of have the two twisty ends, and the middle of it is the bulk. The middle of it's the good part. That's you need the outsides to get to the Tootsie Roll, but the middle is the good part. The Tootsie Roll is that thing you're really going after. So hopefully that kind of helps as well. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes.
Great. Do we have anyone who's doing TV? Okay, let me kind of I'll quickly run through this just so that you guys have it for any future TV you might be doing, but I won't spend as much time. We don't do a 363 for TV largely because there's just not as much material in TV. You're writing a half hour, maybe an hour, and you have multiple storylines. So every single storyline within TV is probably only going to be at most 15 to 20 minutes. Maybe, if you're doing a true procedural like a Law and Order, you have like an A story that is 40 plus minutes of the story, right? But still not the length of a feature. And so we do for TV is we do individual storyline outline, like separated storyline outlines. So they go through the same structure as a feature, right? We have a setup event, we have a midpoint complication, we have a low point, we have a battle scene. But we don't need a 363 because you might not even have 12 scenes, let alone 12 sequences. The example I often give is there's a C line in an episode of How I Met Your Mother where it was literally just 3 scenes and they were kind of interstitial with other scenes that were going on. And it literally had everything. It was the episode where Barney presents the lemon law, which is like if you're dating and it's the first 5 minutes of a date and you realize the date sucks, you could just leave without like no harm, no foul kind of thing. And he presents it to Lily. And we already know the backstory of Barney. He's a womanizer. And Lily, kind of creates the like dynamic of like, this is a bad idea, like this is so mean, whatever, whatever. So that's one scene. And then during a scene in the bar, Barney reveals that he has a date that is there and he's gonna like, maybe he'll test out the lemon law, right? He goes on the date and the woman actually winds up lemon lawing him, which is the complication. So we have literally like the start of the second act and the complication all within the matter of a couple of lines of a scene. Then we have the low point, which is he returns. This is all part of that same second scene, essentially. He returns to the table and tells everyone what happened. And and then we have the battle scene where Lily's like, "See, doesn't that feel awful?" And Barney's like, "No, it was great. Like we resolved the date. No harm, no right." Like, and it was literally like 2, maybe 3 scenes. Now that's an extreme example, but my point is just to say, and it was a C storyline within a half-hour comedy. But my point of saying that is you could literally have like that little and it still works. That's why we don't do 363s for TV. So we would do individual stories. So like the way that I kind of just outlined that storyline, you would write that out as a storyline for your C storyline. And then you would ultimately put all of your storylines together, usually like an A, B, a C, maybe a D, and you would have a storyline outline for your entire pilot. And if anyone wants any more, I won't, because I do want to get to the premise lines. Happy to go over that more if anyone has any questions about TV, during office hours, stuff like that. So let's go over premise lines now. So feel free to bring up the emails, and I'm going to just go in the order they came in. Why don't we do this? I'll probably wind up inevitably rereading the whole thing over again, but I'll have other people read other people's premise lines, so people aren't on the spot. So, Brian, do you mind reading Candace's premise line for us? If you have it handy, and you're still muted.
Yeah, let me just bring it up real quick.
Sure.
Okay, showtime. Candace Edmondson. When a woman in her late 40s learns oh, when a woman in her late 40s learns she can't have kids, she embarks on a solo tequila-filled adventure to live out her mom friend's wildest if I wasn't a mom bucket lists until her husband calls to say they've been fast-tracked for an adoption interview and she's stuck in a foreign jail.
Cool. All right. So I think there's a lot of fun stuff going on here. So let's just take a look at some of what's going on here. One, I think the idea of like if I wasn't a mom's bucket list feels already like a conceit. It feels like fresh entertainment. It feels like something we haven't necessarily seen before, right? We have some elements of this we have. A woman in her 40s that can't have kids. It feels like ground we visited before, but this is a different take on it. So already you have some strengths in here that we like. Um, I am starting to wonder who the dynamic character is. I mean, you say that she's on a solo tequila fueled adventure. And so part of me starts to wonder, like, well, who is she engaging with and why do we care versus this just becoming an episodic development of her doing stuff until she gets the call about the adoption, which also makes me start to wonder where in the story the adoption lands, right? It could be the midpoint complication. I mean, frankly, it probably isn't, but it could be a setup event and we're watching her figure out how to get out of a foreign jail. I don't think that's the case, but it could be in theory. Um, you know, I'm wondering, especially if it's the mom friends, if I wasn't a mom bucket list, I'm curious how the moms kind of factor into it, if they do at all. So I would look for who that dynamic character is. I also kind of wonder if, I think you're falling into the trapping of like you can like your main character a little bit less in that bucket, right? Just by the nature of like when we start to define her, she's a woman in her late 40s. It's fine. It's a fine definition. I think we could probably get a little bit more mileage out of that. You start to wonder, like, is it too late to be a mom? Not even biologically, but just kind of like logically in a way of like, do I want to start to be a mom in my early 50s kind of vibe, right? Um, she can't have kids. It's kind of like, it's a setup. We do need to know that information, but I don't know if that's like really her stage of life. Like, in a way, I'd almost kind of ask the question to you, like how was she living before if she didn't have kids, right? Like what, like this bucket list might have just been her life prior to this moment. I assume it's not, but why wasn't it? What's causing her to kind of go down this road right now? Is it the realization that she can't have kids that kind of causes it? So, think about a little bit of her life prior to this moment. It'll start to kind of inform a little bit more, right? If we think about the phrasing, like she embarks on a solo tequila fueled adventure, it's fun. If we think about like the genre of it all, it starts to get us into that genre. But I don't know if it does any more than like uh live out her mom friend's wildest if I wasn't a mom bucket list. Like it feels like it's almost doubling down on that same phrase. And in terms of a premise line, right, we're counting our words. And so I think that there's more room. Like I like that you're getting to the I like the if I wasn't a mom bucket list. I mean, I wonder if there's a way we can like shorten that even to like non-mom bucket lists so that we win back 4 words like the, if I wasn't and non-mom becomes 1 word because we have a dash in there, right? Like, I'm earning you back some words just that way. And even if in the movie it's called If I Wasn't a Mom bucket list, just for the sake of the premise line, buy yourself those words. But I kind of want to know like what she's doing and how she's engaging. I also really want you to think about uh, the stakes of this, right? Because I don't think that, and this is what I was going to say with the you could like your main character a little bit less. I don't think that a woman going on an adventure, even if it leads to foreign jail, depending on what she's doing, is really a misbehavior. One, even if she was a mom, I don't think it's necessarily a misbehavior. She's kind of doing it in a responsible way. She's like chosen to go on a vacation. She's chosen to like leave responsibilities behind in a way. So she's being pretty responsible, uh, and she, the being fast tracked for an adoption is coincidentally being thrust upon her from the way this sentence is structured, right? It doesn't seem like so I'm not actually sure what her misbehavior is here. It seems like she's just I mean, it actually seems like she's kind of a responsible person, even in the sense of I don't know exactly when she learns that she can't have kids, but like maybe she learns that and needs a break, and now she's like, I'm actually doing this in an incredibly responsible way, right? So I would encourage you to like your character a little bit less. The mitigating factor is totally there, right? Like, someone who learns that they can't have kids, the uh, you're identifying without telling us that she probably wants kids, right? Because she actively learned or in some way learned that she couldn't have kids. So what she does and how she engages with that information is going to be mitigated because she's learned something really difficult. But I don't necessarily see a misbehavior. I don't think going on this journey is. And I'm a little concerned that it is episodic because you have a bucket list aspect. So without that misbehavior. So what I would start to think about is, okay, I have this really interesting conceit. How is she growing through the bucket list that she is going on? And it might be, a little bit, it sounds like it's a bit of a comedy. So maybe it is a little bit of a hangover situation. And maybe you want to think about, is she not, maybe like we realize that she's not as responsible as she needed to become a mom, and that was kind of a blessing in disguise. And through this journey, she learns responsibility or something like that. So I'm not saying that's what you should do, but I would just say put it on her. Give a little bit more onus of like she needs to learn something on this journey. Otherwise, it's just a fictitious,
Mhm.
non-mom going on a journey. Yeah, Bobby. And I just before you jump in, I do want to say, in terms of everyone's premise lines, I know I'm giving a bunch of really direct feedback. If you have questions about my feedback, or if you have kind of like uh, overall like thoughts, I would just kind of caution everyone, like, don't start harping on anyone's premise lines or anything like that. Just we want to make sure everyone feels like safe here and everything like that too. So Bobby, go ahead if you have a thing to jump in on, but I don't want
No,
to.
I just had a quick question. Is her situation in life, scenario in life about, her choices in going on this trip and this and that, would that be considered the opponent because of where she is and she's going on?
Sure. Yeah, and so this is another thing. I think that I don't. I would strongly advise not to have a situation or a location be the opponent. Man, I mean, there was a long time where we would get like the opponent is the healthcare industry, and I'm like, look, I get it. I mean, man, I think it was actually at a time when I actually had the only like serious illness I've ever had in my life, and I had to deal with like, I mean, my doctor was phenomenal. If anyone needs a primary care physician recommendation out in LA, I got a guy for you. But like everyone else felt like an absolute nightmare. And so I totally get that feeling. Uh, but it's not particularly interesting to be on the phone with healthcare. And no one's going to want to watch a movie about that, right? So I would encourage people to not make locations or situations to be the opponent, I would look for a person to actually embody it. Even when it was like when people did want to write healthcare stuff, I would always be like, have there be a doctor. You know, you could have other proxies if you need it, but like, I don't want to watch a movie where someone describes their healthcare issues to 47 different people. Like that's not going to be interesting, you know? Have there be a doctor, have there be a person. So I would look for an opponent. Candace, I have a feeling that part of the reason why you're at this point maybe going to have trouble identifying an opponent directly is because I think you need to spend a little bit more time identifying misbehavior. And then once you identify the misbehavior a little bit more, an opponent will probably naturally start to potentially appear. I might be the husband because maybe he is ready to be a dad in a way that she's not ready to be a mom or something like that, you know, or maybe it's a different friend who, I don't know, makes her feel a certain way or something like that. So I think that that will kind of appear more naturally. Martha, yeah.
Thanks. So are we supposed to put the opponent in the premise line? I've missed that part if we
Uh,
are.
I think that you know, it's going to be somewhat premise line dependent. You know, there's not a firm rule of they always have to appear, so it might be more obvious in certain ways. Um, I would say that you can look to, and you probably should look to, but it's possible they might not show up. You know, if I'm writing a horror film, it'd be shocking as hell if the opponent wasn't there. Um, you know, if I was writing The Fifth Element, don't, you know, the opponent is probably so loose in Gary Oldman that it might be in reference to something bigger than Gary Oldman. And even though I'd kind of give a little bit of a note on that, even produced movies are not perfect movies, right? In a different world, we might look at something like that and go, there could have been more Gary Oldman. There could have been more opposition. Now, the set pieces of The Fifth Element were 10 out of 10 amazing. You know what I mean? But maybe the, you know, opponent motive suffered greatly. You know, if we really broke down that script, we might go, you know, the opponent's like a 2 out of 10. It's really a lackluster opponent. But the conceit was really good, right? There were some amazing set pieces. Just so, you know, it's going to depend, is really, you know, without going too down a rabbit hole,
So,
it's going to depend
so
on
a
your.
so a twist at the end of a story is not an opponent when it reveals the
No. So yeah, this is I often say this. This is just something to think about. You know, feel free. You can call me on Wednesday and say, Brad, you're an
yeah.
idiot. You're totally wrong about this. I personally have never watched a movie and gone, you know, I absolutely hated the first 87 minutes of that movie. But that twist at the end made it really worth the nightmare journey that I went on. I've watched a lot of movies where I go, the journey was good, even though the ending left me a little eh. And I'm look, obviously the best movies are the ones that are great throughout, but I'd much rather watch a movie that entertained me for 84 minutes and left me going, there could have been a better ending than a movie that made me suffer through 87 minutes of garbage and then I go, there was a twist, you know, like I didn't, you know. So yeah, I would encourage you to not do that because it's going to be very hard to get people to stay through to the end. Does that? I'll jump into the next one, but does anyone have any other quick questions that have come up from this? And Candace, does that make? I guess I should bet before I jump into the next one. Any thought? You were great. You took all the notes with a smile. Do you have any thoughts or any questions that we can kind of quickly get to here? Otherwise, I encourage you to take some of this feedback, think about it for a little bit, and you know, send it to me for office hours too.
Yeah, no, short answer, I understand everything that you're saying. Some of them I do have answers, you know, that I've already sort of thought through, as
Great.
far as where the story goes. But your notes specifically just make me have to just tighten things up a little bit and just, you know, plug it into the premise line so that someone doesn't read it and walk away with those questions that you asked.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, look, there's fat in here too. Even just going a woman in her late 40s. Like I don't know if the when part of it is doing much, right? a woman, I mean, even like a woman in her 40s, does like late 40s do a lot in terms of this premise line specifically? Or frankly, 50-year-old woman, you know, if it's really that she's supposed to be like on the verge of 50, you know, I mean, I know there's like, but like you could probably start to go like, oh, there's like how much work is when and in her late. I mean, even just the fact that you reference a woman and use the word her within two words of each other, I start to go, there has to be a way to shorten that because literally all you've identified is that she's a woman twice in the first 5 words, right? So there is a little bit of, and I'm being like nitpicky. I think Glenn might have sat through me doing this to him, or someone sat through me doing this to them on Wednesday, and part of it is I've done this a whole bunch, so I'm able to kind of like nitpick these words, even like learns she, you know, she is missing, but she can't have kids. Uh, you know, even if we shortened it to a woman, a 50-year-old woman who can't have kids, we probably get uh, a couple of words back that way, right? And then, yeah, same thing. She embarks on a solo, you know, like, of course, she's going to embark on an adventure. That's inherently what people do in a story, you know? Um, so we could, you know, probably shorten all of that and get like 10 words out of that. Until her husband you know, and even like her husband calling, I start to go, well, we don't know anything about the husband yet, so him calling is kind of just a moment. I'm curious to know more about the husband and their relationship that she went on this solo trip, but you're not providing that in this premise line. So realistically, if he's not doing a lot in this story, which he might not be, and that's okay too, then all of this could even be shortened to, you know, until she's been fast tracked for adoption and her interview date, you know, is set while she's stuck in jail. And I go, oh, we cut a couple of words there too, because the call itself is just a moment. It's not really, you know, doing anything for this premise line, right? So you do have a bunch of, you know, fat here that we could start to trim and go, you can get more of whatever that second act adventure is into that story and tell us more about what she's going through. So there's room here, and that's okay. You know, we expect that in these early premise lines, and it's the first time you're going through this exercise too. So you're kind of going through it, and you'll see as I go through others. I think it's easier when you're seeing someone else's thing than your own because you're hearing all this and you're going, I have an answer for that. That's important for that. You know, I get it. I totally get it. But yeah, so let's jump over to Glenn's. Um, and Martha, can I put you on the spot? Do you mind reading Glenn's for us?
I hope Glenn doesn't mind. An unsuccessful artist and musician becomes responsible for previously unknown talented young niece. As he shepherds her meteoric rise to stardom on stage and screen, he struggles to capitalize on her success for his own benefit before ultimately realizing he must protect her from her wacky mother and others also seeking to exploit her.
Great. Yeah, and Glenn, you were now that I'm rereading it. Yes, Glenn, we had this conversation the other day. So I'll probably hit some similar notes, but it's good to see some changes have occurred. Okay, so yeah, first off, you know, I think there's a fun story here. You know, we're seeing a little bit of the, you know, potentially indie darlingness to it all. I think that it's a fun contrast of these ages and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of good stuff here that you're starting off from. I think similarly, we could spend a little bit more time on that misbehavior, right? Being unsuccessful isn't necessarily a misbehavior. I think, again, even just saying artist and musician. Now, I gather, I think from our conversation, that the niece is going to be a musician of some sort or singer. And so, you know, I don't know if artist and musician is doing a lot of mileage versus just being like an unsuccessful musician, right? And then you can kind of get into the heart of it. And I'd love to see a little bit more of like maybe what led to that lack of success there. Because I'm still starting to go, he struggles to capitalize on her success for his own benefit, which makes me think that maybe there's a connection of like him being a selfish character and he needs to learn to be more selfless in some way along this journey. So you're starting to kind of build those blocks of connecting if that's what it's meant to be. But I think that we can get more mileage, in terms of what he's actively doing. You know, I think same thing with like stage and screen. Uh, I don't know, meteoric rise to stardom. I don't know if we need more than that, right? So you still have some fat there, unless the fact that she's on stage or on screen is really going to be informing what he's doing to manipulate the situation that he can take advantage of. But again, I'd rather almost kind of see, like, you could almost kind of do the inverse of that, where it's like, uh, you know, he tries to duet with her or whatever. He tries to like join her music in XYZ way for his own benefit. And I'd go, okay, she's a musical talent. Like I've easily connected those dots. So I want to see a little bit more mileage out of like him and what he's doing. Um, I think that the before ultimately realizing he must protect her from her wacky mother. I know you're trying to get in what seems like the opponent. Um, I think the addition of and others also seeking to exploit her, because you haven't differentiated how he's looking to exploit her, or even how she's vulnerable to being exploited, other than being like young and seemingly having no one all that intelligent around her. Uh, I'm not as worried about the others seeking to exploit her. I'm also concerned that you're giving yourself a little permission to be episodic. Um, in terms of like, well, if he's trying to exploit her and the wacky mother is probably trying to exploit her and others are trying to exploit her, are we just watching a movie about a young girl who's potentially getting exploited as compared to this guy who has to grow from the exposure of all that? So I think that, even if there are moments where we have those like proxy opponents who are trying to exploit her, it doesn't necessarily have to live in this premise line. I'd rather get more mileage as to like what he's doing and how he's doing it. And then, we'll see in the scene outline those other moments of other people trying to exploit her, but I wouldn't lean heavily into that. I also think that ultimately, if you give us a bit more about the uh, struggles that he looks to capitalize on her, and then kind of give us a little bit more mileage as to how that adventure plays out for the two of them, you probably won't even really need the phrase before ultimately realizing he must protect her, because you're probably going to give us whatever that adventure is, and then we'll realize she needs an iteration of protection that only he can provide through his growth, and then that phrase will become redundant. And I know this early, this kind of goes back to what Martha was pointed out earlier, which is, hey, you know, it's easier said than done, right? It's easier to say to do that or to look at a produced film and see how that's been done as compared to actually doing it. But I would say if you spend another half hour, 45 minutes, and you spend that time on that second act adventure, I would encourage you to try to get a few more phrases out of it that then allows you to like cut that realization aspect out. And I would say give yourself the freedom of using those words in the second act adventure and see if you can naturally cut that phrase out. And if you do that, I think that it'll inherently be a better premise line for that. And we'll understand that that's his growth. If also strengthen his misbehavior, which that would be my big focus. Because I don't think being an unsuccessful musician is really misbehavior. It almost feels like his misbehavior has gotten moved down to the capitalizing on her, success, like kind of abusing her in that sort of way. And so I'd go, well, if you take that phrase, move it up into his misbehavior, an unsuccessful musician who looks to exploit others in blah 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 way becomes responsible for his, rising star niece, and then you could tell us what actually happens in that second act adventure, and the unsuccessful, you kind of get it all out, and you don't have to worry about kind of framing that because we're gonna, in a way, and we don't see this that often. You've put the second act adventure under his or over his misbehavior in a way. So you can elevate that and it'll help inform, what you've written there. Does that make sense? And well, I see your hand, so I'll take you in a second, but I just want to make sure. Glenn, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great feedback. Yeah, it's I'm getting lots of ideas on how to how to retweak it here.
Great.
Particularly defining the misbehavior, because I think I have a whole idea of what the misbehavior is in my mind,
Yeah.
but it's obviously not coming through in the way that I intended in that
Well, I think if you move the concept of the fact that he is somebody who would take advantage of a person for his own opportunities, if that's what his growth is, if you move that up and then you showcase that he's put in this situation where he can take advantage, and then you describe what happens between him and the niece in that second act adventure, you're most of the way there. It's just that you've actually kind of started to identify the misbehavior. You've almost put like the long phrase of it into your second act adventure and then let that be your second act adventure, as compared to taking it, moving it into the description of your character and then giving yourself room to describe him. And you have that room because even if you took that whole phrase and you made it an unsuccessful musician who looks to capitalize on other people's success for his own benefit, becomes responsible for his rising success niece, and then you start to get into your second, like you could cut everything before ultimately seeking, and you've gotten back. I'm not going to count it here for everyone's sake of watching me have to count, but like 15-ish words. This looks like it's pretty close to 50 words, but you might have 15 to 20 words to then start to put in as that second act adventure, and you pretty much have your premise line at that point. And then you could even start to go, well, if I needed an extra 5 words to you describe my second act adventure, we can take the phrase he struggles to capitalize on her success for his own benefit, which is 10 words. There's a way that we could shorten it down to 5 words or so, and you'd earn back those 5 words with no problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're 80% of the way there. It's just the 20% that I want to see is that second act interaction between him and the niece that's really showcasing how these things in a broad scope transpire as compared to just the underlying like why he's doing it, which is his misbehavior. Yeah, go ahead, Bo.
Are you saying Bo or Bob?
I think
Bo.
you said Bo.
Oh, Bo.
This seemed like a good time to bring up the earlier question I had. It seems like my understanding of this is let's say in this example, the misbehavior is exploiting people,
Yeah.
or selfishness, whatever it wants to be.
Yeah.
That would become evident in the first act.
Yes.
And then in the second act, something happens. Maybe he gets the niece and like he starts exploiting her, but something happens and that starts the second act where he's like being not exploiting her, protecting her. This is your quote unquote training montage of this journey. And then there's a low point. But basically that second act is unlearning the misbehavior or overcoming the misbehavior.
Well, so we'd probably, without writing Glenn's story here, right? We'd probably have some iteration of he cares more for his niece than he does random other people in the world, right? So he's probably going to be put in situations, he's also spending more time with his niece and he's getting to know her more personally, right? So we might see an iteration where he's put in this conflict of, maybe I do have a little bit of an opportunity, but I see that I have to help her, right? And so we see that sort of growth. And then there'd probably be some type of complication that happens in the middle where he's given some big opportunity and he has to choose between her and himself. And he's probably going to make some type of wrong choice to a degree. He's going to probably revert back to that misbehavior. And then we're probably going to see an estrangement between him and the niece. And then the low point is there's probably a total estrangement of some sort. And then we'll see a battle scene where he does ultimately choose her. That'd be kind of a traditional arc. That might not be what Glenn's doing. I'm not saying he should revise it to do that, but that would probably be the more traditional arc of like, yes, he's going to have some type of growth. There's going to be something that happens that makes him have to choose in the complication, and then he'll probably revert, and then he'll lose everything he's gained, and then ultimately have some type of battle scene where he'll make the ultimate correct choice and showcase that he's truly grown.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. I don't, again, not to undermine whatever you're doing, Glens. Don't necessarily do that just because we've pointed it out.
Yeah, no, totally. Thanks.
So yeah, and then I did forget we were going to go over scenes versus windows. So let's do Martha's premise line, and then I'll backtrack a little bit to the lesson if you guys haven't. I know we're already over by a little bit, but I want to make sure we get to that just as a quick aside because I know there's a question too. So let's Glenn, you mind reading Martha's? Or
Sure.
yeah.
After the loss of a crew member, a young officer micromanages, lashes out at her crew, and seeks comfort from her Navy SEAL lover to find he prioritizes his new fix, theft of precious Iraqi artifacts, over their relationship, sending her back to sea navigating unfamiliar territory, mined waters, and enemy fire.
Great. Okay, Martha. So yeah, we have a lot of fun stuff going on. This is a really interesting story. We've talked a bit about it already. So you're falling into a little bit of a different trapping than, and yeah, we've already kind of talked about, not loving your character quite as much. So something I really want you to think of, and I think this is a great example for everyone, because this is something that we see fairly often, but this is the only example we have of it here. So something I kind of talked about, and I'll talk about it maybe a little bit more with scenes, definitely talk about during office hours with you guys at different times. It feels like you're creating a world where the other people around this main character are doing more things, right? Your second act adventure literally kind of starts from to find he prioritizes his new fix over the relationship, right? So it kind of becomes his story in that second act adventure. You're not telling us as much from her end. So I'd really like to like, is this really just a story about a woman who is dating a guy and this guy's doing stuff? I don't think so, right? So it's what is she doing along the journey? Don't worry so much about him. That feels like it's a bit of a setup. Like the most we see from her in this back half of the sentence is sending her back to sea. Well, you know what I mean? Like she didn't even do that. She was told, I mean, especially in the military world, right? She was told by somebody who I assume is higher up than her, given the fact that he's able to tell her to go do this thing. You know, you've really kind of mitigated the fact that she is, because it's not even like, you know, well, if Jeff tells me to be here and teach this class, I could tell him to go fuck himself because like I'm not going to be court-martialed or anything like that, right? I might get fired, but I'm not going to go to any type of jail. Like you are literally putting her in a situation where she might face real ramifications. So she really is not making any sort of decision whatsoever. She's just being thrust into a situation. So this is a great example of something where I'd really push you to go, what is my story from her perspective? And like, what is she going through? I think you're also a little too specific in terms of misbehavior, and this is kind of like the next level of not liking your character too much. I don't know if like micromanaging is a misbehavior. You know, it can be frustrating, and it could come from like what I would say is elevate the question of like why is she micromanaging? Why is she lashing out at her crew? Even to a degree, why does she seek comfort from this guy? Although it feels like that's kind of a different concept than the first two. The why she does those things is probably going to lead you to your misbehavior. Right now, you kind of have action that is caused by the misbehavior. But again, like my concern of you liking your main character too much is if you have lashes out at her crew as a as like the misbehavior. Well, if her crew is doing dumb stuff or whatever, it's appropriate to lash out sometimes. Again, maybe not in the military, you know, where things are maybe a little bit more formal. But in regular life, it's totally reasonable to, a kid goes to touch a hot stove over and over again. It is totally reasonable for a parent to go, stop it, don't do that. You know what I mean? Like because you want what's good for your kid, and maybe it's just a very knee-jerky reaction of some sort. But it doesn't make you a bad parent just because you yelled at your kid for a second, right? So the why she does those things is going to be important. And my slight concern, given some of the conversations we had, and again, this is probably something we can take into Wednesday, but I'll say it here now, is if the reason is she's being mistreated because she's a woman in this world, it becomes a little bit of the question of like, is she really responsible for other people's actions towards her just because she's a woman? Not really. So you've kind of totally mitigated the fact that she has a misbehavior. You've thrust it back onto them. So I really kind of encourage. Now, kind of like the Shrek example, her misbehavior could come from the way she's been treated as a woman in this world that leads her to be a certain way towards the people that she is engaging with. But make sure that you are defining how, like with Shrek, right? It's that like I'm leading with he rejects others before they could get close to him. I'm still leading with what he is doing, even though I'm mitigating it by the fact that it's because uh he's been historically rejected from the community. So it's fine that it stems from that thing, but make sure that you are identifying what she is doing, not just in some ways being like, well, she's being mistreated because she's a woman, so she lashes out. It's like, yeah, that's a perfectly reasonable response to a situation. Does that make sense?
It does, and that was more of like a subcategory. She's doesn't want them to die. She wants to bring them all home alive, and they've never been in combat before.
Gotcha. Bo, take
So,
it very quickly. Bo, all good. I'll go over scenes and windows for a quick second. So
okay.
feel free to watch the last like 5 to 10 minutes of this. I'll send this out to you guys Monday. But I just wanted to let Bo know that. Yeah, sorry, Martha, go ahead. And then Brian, I see you also.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to mention that obviously I really need to rework this because the point of the story is you have a young officer who's not been in combat before. She's outgunned and a crew that's new to combat, and she doesn't want them to die. She needs to bring them home alive. And I actually had a premise that started with that, and then Jeff was like, "You need to get to the dynamic
Oh,
character
Brian,
earlier."
wait 1 second. Brian, are you taking it off also? Is that?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, okay, okay. I thought. Sorry. Go ahead, Martha. Go ahead. Sorry.
So I may be misunderstood, but I was given input that I should get to my dynamic character sooner. That's why I put the Navy SEAL forward as
Yeah.
opposed to what she's doing. But then I'm having trouble with my opponent because I realize I probably left my opponent out. Um,
That's totally fair. I think that if we're kind of going through a bit of this, I start to go for the premise line's sake, how important is the loss of a crew member? Partly because you start to have to, I mean, some of this could just be framed as uh uh you know, uh in a death trap, you
yeah.
know, and like, is it literally a death trap? Not really, but it is a military situation, so you're not using it the same way that like I don't know if I started to try and throw it into like this situation, you'd be like, Brad, this isn't a literal death. No one's gonna die during this meeting unless the fluke heart attack occurs, right? Like, there's not a death trap here. You are literally using death trap to be like in a military death trap, So like, you can find little phrases. I just go, yeah, I think there's some mileage where I wouldn't worry about it. I think there's some fat you could start to cut. Same thing with like unfamiliar territory, mind waters, enemy fire. I think that could all be shortened down to navigating unfamiliar, dangerous territory, right? And we've just saved ourselves another 1, 2, 3, 4 words easily. So I wouldn't worry too, like, give yourself permission to go a little bit long and resend it to me. And even if it gets like 75 words, we can really cut down, I mean, uh, you know, I think even saying like to find he prioritizes, well, to find isn't telling me that much.
Okay.
And, if you could tell me more in that phrase, great. If there's not that much to be found in that phrase, then why not just shorten it to who prioritizes uh, theft of Iraqi artifacts. And then, you know what I mean? And even that gets you another. So all of a sudden, it's like, well, just in this little exercise alone, I probably bought you 13, 14 words.
Yeah.
And it's, and then that's not even starting to get into the fact that you identify them as lovers and their relationship, which inherently lovers have a relationship. So I start to go, there's probably some mileage where we could even cut there. And so you might have 15, 18, 20 words to play with that. Again, I know that you're like, wait, how do I get all these things in? Well, the redundancy. I mean, I know I like picked on Candace earlier for woman and her, and it's so easy to fall into that trapping of like, that's just how a phrase works. But even just thinking about the fact like, oh, right, those two words are essentially doing the same thing.
Right.
There has to be a way that I can kind of cut a couple of those words that make it work.
And
Glenn, I saw your. Oh, good, Mark.
Sorry. And am I now challenged to put something about the opponent in the situation?
You can. I think that like I would, yeah, I would again give yourself permission to go to like 75 words and then send this to me. And I mean, think about like what I said here, right? So cut some of the words that I've identified for you, and then give yourself room to go a little bit bigger because you're probably going to fall into the same trapping you did here and use words that I'm like, you see how lover and relationship are doing the same thing, and so you'll probably be able to take 75 and go down to 50 from there. So give yourself permission to go. And that's why I know that you guys are all kind of doing that thing of like, how do I get all this stuff in here? And you might not get every aspect of that checklist in, but you'll get a lot of it in if you cut some of these redundancies, which I know it's hard to cut these redundancies. That's part of why we're here too. And you're not going to perfect these premise lines. Don't worry about that. Frankly, even if you wound up with a premise line that was like 57 words and had everything and had a little bit of redundancy, I wouldn't send you home and go spend another 15 minutes and cut those 8 words. I would get to the next exercise. Don't worry about it. Glenn, yeah, I see the hand.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question. So the way I was reading this was the loss of the crew member, and my question probably not to dig into the actual line here, but the loss of the crew member, being the inciting incident was what motivated the misbehavior. The young officer micromanages, lashes out. Is that just a general question? Should we see the misbehavior as being something that was always there and it kind of comes out in the first act, or can it actually stem from an inciting incident?
I think that it's more traditionally something that's always there. Like even if we look at something like The Sixth Sense, right? The fact that he kind of has this estrangement from his wife is seemingly kind of self-evident, even in terms of like the one scene we see for the moment before he gets shot. Um, and so I think that it's probably something that's there regardless of the situation, but I do think the situation can kind of help bring it out a little bit more. That's also why, in this sense, like I think, what I'm identifying for Martha is I think that the lashing on the mic, like, and this is partly through our conversations of like, well, she's a woman in this world who's kind of being mistreated, right? And so that kind of stuff has happened before the loss of this crew member. And so therefore, the way that she's engaged with it prior has probably also started to happen before the loss of this crew member. The loss of the crew member might just be a factor that really brings it to its, I mean, I'm not saying there's literally a scene, not that we've had this conversation, but there might be a scene where the crew member dies and a superior is like, this would never have happened if we didn't, raise a woman into this role. And now it's really thrust into the main stage of, oh, this isn't like a thing that's kind of happening behind the scenes sort of thing. This is a thing that is literally being said out loud in this setting. And so now it's kind of been, so it could be, kind of compounded or heightened in this moment. It probably will be heightened, but it probably was already in existence, which is why I'm pushing Martha to spend a little bit more time thinking about what that is so that these actions are a showcasing of the misbehavior and not kind of identified as misbehavior themselves. Brian, yeah.
To kind of touch on the misbehavior, it's driven by, and misbehavior is like actions. It's not like the intentions that color the actions. Like the Shrek example, like Shrek pushing others away. That action is, in a sense, the misbehavior, but his intentions of that,
I
or
would, I would,
or
yeah,
they,
I would,
is it more
I,
nuanced?
I would say it's more the intention than it is the action. The action is showcasing, because like, we're watching a visual medium. So, we don't really have the ability to live in Shrek's mind. It would be a particularly good movie if we watched or if we had voiceover from Shrek going, "Oh, here comes this donkey that I don't want to be friends with because everyone in Duloc has rejected me." You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to hear someone say that. So, like, the actions are how the misbehavior is shown, which is why, like, I'm not saying to Martha in this case, "Hey, micromanages and lashing out is dumb and a bad choice." What I'm saying is that could be showcasing the misbehavior, but I don't think that is the misbehavior, right? So make sure that you're identifying what that misbehavior is, because I start to really, my note isn't even about that section. I'm identifying it there because it's a placeholder for the misbehavior. But my bigger concern is actually being showcased by the second act adventure being about this other character and not her. And then I go, well, I don't know if the misbehaviors is fully realized, right? Like when we look at Glenn's, the reason why like just to, not directly compare, but to directly compare, the reason why I'm a little less concerned about Glenn's misbehavior is because he kind of identifies it and it feels like it's fitting with some of the other elements a little bit more. I just want Glenn to identify what like what the actual second act adventure is, because right now the misbehavior is kind of like a placeholder for that, whereas for Martha, right, we kind of don't even have the misbehavior fully identified, and therefore we get away from the main character in the second act adventure. So I think there's a world where we might understand the second act adventure a little bit less plot heavy, a little bit more in terms of this main character. We might see how the micromanaging and lashing out showcases a misbehavior. But right now it's just action. And I'm speculating what the misbehavior is through my conversations with Martha, but I think that there's a really good chance that if you guys who were not in on our conversations were reading this premise line, without the context of what we're talking about, you might not even have the insight that I have into this situation, right? And this is where we say, like, it's good to learn through osmosis, because if you read this premise line or listening to Glenn having read it out loud, you probably didn't put the same pieces together that I put together, which isn't the same pieces that Martha's putting together, because, she's the brain behind all of this. And so, we want you to kind of get to a place where someone could read this premise line and go, oh, I understand what the story is, what the theme is, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the bigger overall picture. But I would say it is the intention that causes the actions, but the actions are how the audience is going to discover the intention, right? I don't walk into Shrek knowing his misbehavior. The actions provide that for me. But as a writer, if I was writing Shrek, I'd have to know what the intentions are so I could create the appropriate actions. Does that make sense?
Yes, like when Shek pushes somebody away, the audience begins to infer what the misbehavior could be, and as the story progresses, they kind of begin to infer and fill in more of what the misbehavior is either developing as or what it seems to be more and more obvious to. I know it's kind of
Yeah.
nuanced, and nothing's hard and fast. I get that.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, look, we're also getting other information, right? At the beginning of the first scene of Shrek, I think even before Shrek is shown, all the animals that are able to talk are being bought to be like killed or something like that. Like that's what happens to Dunk, right? Like, and so we understand like, oh, Duloc is kind of cruel to people that are not identified as human, right? And Shrek is not human. So he's an ogre, right? And so we're kind of able to infer more because we learned more information. Something that I like to say is as audience members, and this is why it's hard for writers sometimes, as audience members, we take in information in the opposite way that the writer creates it, right? So we're taking in a whole bunch of actions and moments and scenes, and then we're putting the theme on it once we've completed the journey. The writer can't approach the writing that way. The writer has to see all these bigger macro ideas and then create the micro ideas that showcase it to the audience. So that's why I might feel the way that you're identifying, Brian. But yeah, like as a writer, you kind of want to go in from the opposite end and then create those moments that the audience feels it in the way that it's meant to be felt.
Thanks. That lets me kind of put myself in someone else's shoes a little more effectively.
Yeah, yeah. And you want to, I mean, like, a different way of saying it is like you have, and this is an important thing, like as a writer, what are you trying to say with this piece? Why are you writing this piece? What are you telling us about being a mom in her late 40s who can't have kids, or an unsuccessful artist watching someone else succeed, or a woman in the Navy, right? Like, what are you telling me about that that's not just, I'm making a movie about this person, but I have an actual position on those things, and I'm going to convey them to the audience. But you don't get to, no one walks out before a movie and says, "Hey guys, I'm the writer of this movie. Let me tell you what this movie is about." Candace, thanks for hanging in there. Let me tell you what this movie is about, and then we'll start the movie, right? It doesn't work that way. It only works the opposite way. So, yeah, that's kind of the crux of it all. And then so let me just jump in quickly because I want to wrap up here also. Scenes versus windows very quickly, and I'm happy to kind of go over more of this later on, like in office hours. But basically, at this stage, what we want from you guys in terms of scenes is just kind of like the start of scenes. Brad and Martha get on a call and talk about her script, right? But as you start to develop it, we're going to start to have you go, what is the conflict? What are the agendas of these characters, right? How are the agendas of these characters in conflict? Kind of to what I was saying, how do the scenes kind of inform the bigger overall theme of the story? So you want to start to do that heavy lifting, and we'll see more of that in the scene outline. The big contrast here is like windows. They're just moments into the characters or into the story. They're not necessarily the scene themselves, right? So like a window might be, and this is untrue, but I'll just keep picking on Martha because I've already started to, Brad can't stand Martha. Well, what are the ways that we could see that? Well, when Brad's phone rings and he sees it's Martha, like that would be a window. That's not a scene. I'm not watching a scene of Brad's side before picking up the phone to talk to Martha. But that is a window into, now maybe we want to show that Brad doesn't really care about teaching people writing. So we see that big sigh before everyone calls, or maybe we have another window where he, puts his phone on do not disturb, so all the calls, go to voicemail, and then he goes, "Oh no," but the scene might be when Jeff goes, "Who called for office hours?" and Brad goes, "Oh, no one." Right? And then we have a whole back and forth. So like that would be different than the window, which is, Brad not care. So that's kind of the big distinction here, is that we have windows convey like moments that showcase who the characters are, or what the world is. Right? Like a window in The Fifth Element is all the cars flying about. Well, we know it's a future where it's not a dystopian future. It's actually a technologically advanced future of sorts, but it is a little chaotic, right? It's not that typical thing that we see where they're all in perfect parallel and they all avoid each other. It's not iRobot's version of cars flying past each other where everything is perfect. It is a chaotic mess in the sky, right? And so those are like two windows that are showcasing something similar, a technological future. But they're showcasing a different future just by the way the cars fly in the air in relation to each other, right? So when you're watching movies, think about all those different types of windows that inform you without having to necessarily. No one tells you that when you watch that movie. No one's saying like, "Hey, look at the cars and the way they're flying in the air. It's chaotic. I would have thought they would have been perfect." You know what I mean? Like we don't get that moment in The Fifth Element. It's just. It is what it is. It's telling us it's not that world. It's a different world.
Is that like when Lilu like drops into his taxi cab and his expression on the face is like, "I don't want to help. I don't want to help. I might help." But like the scene is like driving the taxi cab amongst the crazy traffic. Out of nowhere, like a stranger plunges through the ceiling of the taxi cab.
Yeah, and so I would say, maybe his expression could be a little bit of a window. I think that that's probably getting into a scene because we're starting to get into conflict. He's like, if I remember correctly, like I think he's short on like credits or whatever, and he needs to earn the money and driving
Yeah, he's
her.
gonna get fired. Like it starts
Yeah, yeah,
wrapping
yeah.
up, and his boss is up
Right.
his ass.
Right. So I think that gets a little bit more into like scene territory where the conflict is I'm going to lose my job if I don't help this essentially naked woman who fell from the sky out of this situation. Uh, but then, what do I do? Do I like kick her out in the middle of the sky? Like, how does this, kind of work? So there's a conflict in that scene. And I think that that probably is the impetus to the start of the scene.
I see what
Um,
you're illustrating there. Yeah.
But his expression could be a window if he's particularly expressive about being a jerk in some way. I don't know. I don't remember the Fifth Element that well that I would be like, yes, that would be a window. But maybe he had a really specific look that kind of was telling us. And it could be a window within a scene also, right? Like it could be a gentle reminder that he's not just going to be this, generous guy who gives that kind of time because he can
Yeah.
afford to.
Like when Ruby talks to him, he always rolls his eyes, right? Is like Chris Tucker's character, like almost like he wants to interact and he just rolls his eyes like every single time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so we might, I think there's probably a degree where that might be showcasing the fact that he is a very salt of the earth kind of guy versus Ruby is a, you know, A-list celebrity diva-y, whatever, right? Like, so yeah, we're probably getting into, but like a window might be like the attire that Ruby is dressing compared to the way that Bruce Willis is always dressed, right? That would be like a window. Like you don't need to. If I showed you those two pictures and I said, "Hey, we're on like this weird galactic cruise. One of these people is a celebrity and one of them is an average Joe nobody. Who's who?" You don't have to watch the movie to know who's who. You like 99% of the people will pick the right person, and that one person who doesn't is just being an asshole. You know what I mean? Like it's obvious. So that would be like a window, right? Ruby dresses in this futuristic Gucci. Like, I mean, I wonder what I haven't read the script, but you could almost imagine like uh
It's
you
like
know
Versace designed it, you know?
Versace on Mars, right? And if I said Versace on Mars, you go, yeah, that's what he's wearing. I get it, right? That's a window into the fact that they're on a galactic cruiser, that celebrities still exist, that celebrity can, be this from this expanse, right? You get a lot of information, and I could just kind of define that as, yeah, he's wearing Gucci, he's wearing, uh, Martian Gucci, and you go, yeah, I get it. Right? I bet you I bet if we read it, I bet you that there's not a long description of he's wearing a dark blue thing with, things that pop up and whatever. I don't even really, I kind of like loose remember it. But I guarantee like it's some stupid phrase like that. That would just be how you write that. And you let the wardrobe people decide that because, you're a writer, not a wardrobe designer. So does that make sense? Does that kind of help differentiate windows versus scenes as you're getting into your
Fills it in a bit more after having like a little lengthier of a talk just now. That helps
yeah.
me.
And I would say, look, send me, I'm not going to go over every 50-50 and 20-20 with you guys, but like feel free to send that exercise in and we can talk about like which ones are really working, which ones aren't. The best thing I could lead you with is scenes should really start to have conflict. And even if you can't identify the conflict, you could probably start to like there's no conflict in Ruby's wardrobe. Now, it's it showcases that these two men will probably be in conflict with each other because they are so different. But I don't remember a scene where Bruce Willis is like, "You're wearing a stupid thing that," you know what I mean? Like that's not there's no conflict in that. Um, so yeah. All right. Any
Got it.
last questions before we all thanks for hanging in a little extra time. Any final questions from anybody?
I assume the assignments for week 2 are in the book, right?
They are, yes, yes. So go through
Okay.
that, keep on rolling through. The only addition I'll kind of give you is I think it's in there already, but we like to do kind of like a trailer exercise for people. Don't spend a lot of time on this, but you can spend a little bit of time on this where if you do like a trailer exercise, so think about kind of like if you were making a trailer for this movie, what those like heightened points that you would write about in the trailer, in that minute or two would be. Um, we've all seen trailers, so we can kind of visualize that. And then I think it's partly to help you kind of get those scenes out onto the page and start to kind of work a little bit. And then you can also, a good exercise just to kind of start to differentiate if you haven't written a lot before. If you take your battle scene, because chances are most writers have at least some idea of what their battle scene is going to be, you could write it twice, over the course of a page or two. One where it's all dialogue driven, and one where it's all scene direction, right? So just to kind of start to get a feel for what the difference between dialogue and scene direction is and how it works on the page. Not that you would ever really write a scene that's all dialogue, or you very rarely write a scene that is all scene direction that is as long as a battle scene would be. But it gives you a feel for what each can do, especially when you kind of remove the other one as a tool. I don't really need to see either of those exercises. I don't know if it's helpful to get notes on either one of those, but it's good for you to kind of start to just get an opportunity to like learn through those exercises. I think those are mentioned in the week 2 pages at the end of week 2, but if they're not, you can add those on too. But I wouldn't make that a priority or spend a lot of time on either one of those. All right. Well, everyone have a great rest of the weekend, and check in during office hours, party hard.
Thanks
Yeah.
so much. I appreciate
Talk to
you
you
for
guys
going over.
Yeah,
Thanks,
my
Todd.
pleasure.